He laughed at her face, not a polite dismissal, not a quiet refusal. A laugh loud, contemptuous, the kind that was meant to follow a person out the door and down the road and all the way back to wherever they came from. Silas Rourke stood on the porch of his crumbling ranch with his arms crossed and his jaw set, looking at the young woman in front of him like she was the punchline of a joke he'd been waiting years to hear. "Fix my ranch," he said, still half smiling, "and I'll marry you." He expected her to flinch, to blush, to turn around and walk away with whatever dignity she had left. She didn't. She pulled out a notebook, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "Put a number on it instead. I don't want a husband. I want $40. If you've ever been laughed at when you were desperate, if you've ever had someone mock the only thing standing between you and disaster, then you already know exactly how Mara Ellison felt in that moment. And if you stay with me until the end of this story, I promise you won't forget what she did next." Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment right now telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Blackthorn Ranch and to the moment everything changed. The autumn of 1889 arrived in the Wyoming Valley the way bad news always does, quietly at first, then all at once. Mara Ellison had been traveling for 3 days when she first saw Blackthorn Ranch from the ridge above Holland Creek. She stopped walking, shifted the leather satchel on her shoulder, and took a long look at the property below. Any other person might have seen a ranch in rough shape and kept moving. Mara saw something different. She saw problems she recognized. She saw problems she knew how to solve. That was both her gift and her curse. She was 25 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and she had been underestimated so many times in her life that she'd stopped being surprised by it. What she had never stopped doing was showing up anyway. Her boots were worn through on the left heel. Her coat was 2 sizes too big, borrowed from a neighbor back in Casper before she'd started walking. The engineering notebook tucked inside her satchel had belonged to her grandfather, and its pages were so full of his handwriting and her own that there was barely room for anything else. She needed $40. That was the number she carried with her like a stone in her chest. $40 to pay the debt owed to Dr. Heller in Casper, the man who had been treating her grandmother, Agnes Ellison, for the past 4 months. Agnes was 67 years old and had a lung condition that had worsened dramatically when the cold weather came in September. Dr. Heller was a decent man. He had extended credit twice already. But he'd sent a letter the previous week, gentle but firm, explaining that he could not continue treatment without payment, and that he would need to move Agnes out of the warm recovery room he'd been keeping her in if the debt wasn't settled before winter set in hard. The first major snow was expected within 6 to 8 weeks. Mara had exactly $0. She'd tried to find work in Casper. She'd tried the mill, the lumber operation on the east side of town, and 3 different ranches within a day's walk. The mill foreman had laughed. The lumber operation hadn't even let her finish her sentence. 2 of the ranches had turned her away at the gate, and the 3rd had offered her laundry work at a rate that would have taken her 14 weeks to earn $40, assuming she didn't eat or sleep in a bed. She couldn't wait 14 weeks. Agnes didn't have 14 weeks. So when old Pete Granger at the feed store mentioned, almost as an aside, that the Blackthorn Ranch was in bad shape and that its owner, Silas Rourke, had been burning through hired men faster than firewood, Mara had asked one question: is the foreman position still open? Pete had looked at her over his spectacles and said, technically. But girl, that place is dying. And Rourke is... He paused, searching for the right word. Difficult. How far is it? 3 days on foot, maybe 2 if you push. She pushed. She arrived at Blackthorn Ranch on a Thursday afternoon with sore feet, a clear head, and a plan she'd been refining since the first ridge. She'd observed the property from every angle she could manage on the approach: the way the barn listed slightly to the left, the dilshishin in the soil near the well that indicated mineral contamination, the fence lines that had been patched so many times they looked like a quilt. She'd seen problems like these in the engineering texts her grandfather had collected. Not ranching books, engineering books, soil mechanics. Load distribution, water tables. Her grandfather had been a self-educated man who believed that understanding the ground beneath your feet was the most important knowledge a person could have. She knocked on the front door of the ranch house. A man opened it who was nothing like what she'd imagined. Silas Rourke was 39, tall and lean in the way that came from actual work rather than vanity, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were the particular shade of gray that made people uncomfortable when he looked at them directly. He had a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work, and something in his expression, some permanent set of the jaw, suggested that he had decided a long time ago not to be surprised by anything, and had been failing at that goal ever since. He looked at Mara the way a man looks at something that doesn't make sense. "I'm here about the foreman position," Mara said. She didn't offer her hand. She'd learned that offering your hand first sometimes gave men an excuse to dismiss you before you'd said a word. Silas stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "Who sent you?" "Nobody. I heard the position was available." "It's not available," for he stopped himself. Started again. "It's a ranch foreman job. You understand what that means?" "I understand what a foreman does, yes." He leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms. "Then you understand it means managing cattle, overseeing hired hands, doing physical labor in every kind of weather." "I do. And you think you can do that?" "I think I can fix what's wrong with this ranch before the first snow. The barn foundation, the well, the fence lines on the north pasture. Those are your three biggest problems, and they're all solvable." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't respect, not yet. It was something more dangerous than respect. It was the look of a man who has been told something that interests him against his will. "You walked around my property?" he said. I observed it on the approach. "You can learn a lot about a property from a distance." "Can you?" It wasn't a question. He was quiet for a moment, and then something in him seemed to make a decision, the wrong one, as it turned out. Corner of his mouth pulled up. Not a smile. Something colder than a smile. "All right," he said. "Here's what I'll offer you. Fix this ranch, all of it. Everything that's failing before the first snow hits. Do that and I'll marry you. How's that for a foreman's wage?" He waited. He was watching her face the way a man watches a gamble pay off. The humiliation was deliberate and precise. It was designed to remind her that she was a young woman asking for a job that men twice her age had already walked away from, and that the most generous interpretation of her presence here was entertainment. It was the kind of offer that meant, "Go home, little girl. You have no business being here." Mara was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "I don't want a husband," she said. "I want $40. Payable when the work is done. If I fix the barn foundation and restore clean water to the well before the first snow, you pay me $40. If I fail, I walk away with nothing. No charity, no partial payment." Silas blinked. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. "You're serious," he said. "Write it down if you want," Mara said. "I'll sign it." He studied her for a long moment. She didn't look away. She'd learned that looking away was the thing that made men feel like they'd already won. Finally, Silas uncrossed his arms. "You'll quit in 3 days," he said. "This ranch has broken better people than you. Then you've got nothing to lose by agreeing." Another long pause, and then, without quite understanding why he was doing it, Silas Rourke nodded. "Fine, $40, if you actually do it." "When I do it," Mara said. "Where do you want me to start?" He pointed toward the barn. She picked up her satchel and walked. She didn't look back. The barn was worse up close than it had looked from the ridge. The left wall had developed a lean that wasn't structural incompetence. It was something underneath, something moving. Mara spent the first 2 hours of her first day not repairing anything but walking, measuring, pressing her boot into the ground at intervals, and feeling for the give. Her grandfather had taught her that the ground tells you everything if you know how to listen to it. Most people, he said, try to fix what they can see. The trouble almost always starts with what they can't. She found the problem on the third pass. The barn had been built on a shelf of mixed shale and sand, unstable, compressible, the kind of substrate that shifted incrementally with each season's freeze and thaw. Every repair that had been done to that barn over the years had addressed the walls and the beams and the roofline. Nobody had gone down far enough to find out why those things kept failing. It was like patching a roof every year without asking why the house was sinking. She went back to the ranch house that evening, sat at the kitchen table Silas had grudgingly allowed her to use, and spent 2 hours with her grandfather's notebook working through calculations she'd done before, but in a field context. Load distribution over unstable substrate, the depth required to reach load-bearing material, the geometry of timber anchoring. Silas came through the kitchen once, looked at the notebook, looked at her, and kept walking without saying anything. The next morning, she started digging. She'd asked for a spade and a mattock. Silas had handed them over with an expression that said he expected her to last until noon. By noon, she was 4 feet down. By the end of the second day, 6 feet. Her hands split on the third day, not raw, not blistered, but actually split across the palms where the skin had dried and cracked from the constant friction and the cold. She wrapped them in strips torn from an old shirt she found in the bunkhouse and kept going. The pain was real and constant, and she did not have the luxury of stopping for it. Silas watched from the fence line on the third afternoon. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with his hands in his coat pockets and watched her work. She was aware of his presence the way you're aware of weather, not threatening exactly, but something to be accounted for. On the fourth day, 12 feet down, her mattock struck granite. She didn't cheer. She didn't call out. She pressed her hand flat against the granite surface and felt the solidity of it, and something in her chest, the tightness that had been living there since she'd left Casper loosened a fraction. There it was. That was what she needed. She climbed out of the trench, found a piece of charcoal, and started marking timber. She needed 4 main pillars, each notched at the base to seat into the granite and capped at the top to carry the barn's load. The design wasn't complicated, but it required precision. If the pillars were seated wrong, the transferred load would be uneven, and the wall would continue to lean. If they were capped wrong, the connection point would fail before the first hard winter. She worked the timber all that evening by lantern light, and that's when Silas Rourke spoke to her for the first time in 4 days. He came into the work area, not the barn exactly, but the space beside it where she'd set up to shape the timber, and stood watching for a moment. Then he said, "Where'd you learn to work timber like that?" "My grandfather," Mara said, without looking up. "He was an engineer." "Self-taught. An engineer. Yes. What kind of engineer works on ranches?" She looked up then. The kind who understood that the problems on a ranch and the problems in a bridge are the same problem. Load, substrate, transfer. The materials are different. Principles aren't. Silas was quiet for a moment. "And he taught you all this." "He taught me how to think about it," Mara said. "The rest I worked out myself." Something moved across his face, just briefly, gone before she could read it clearly, and then it was closed again, that careful blankness he seemed to wear like armor. "You really think this is going to work?" he said. "I think it'll work if we have enough time to set the timber before the ground freezes." "We?" She looked at him steadily. "The pillars are too heavy for one person to seat correctly." "I was going to ask if you'd be willing to help with that part." He seemed briefly startled, like he'd expected her to say something else, ask for something else. Then he nodded once short. "I can do that. Thank you," Mara said. She meant it. She wasn't performing gratitude. She needed the help, and she knew it, and pretending otherwise would have been stupid, and she'd never had the luxury of being stupid. Silas turned to leave and then stopped. "Your hands," he said. She glanced down. The strips of cloth were dark at the palms. "They're fine. There's salve in the house. Second cabinet on the left." She didn't respond immediately. She was looking at the timber mark she'd been working on. Thank you, she said again, quieter this time. He left without answering. She found the salve that night. It helped more than she wanted to admit. The next 3 days were the hardest work of her life, and she'd had a life that didn't lack for hard work. Setting the granite and cord pillars required not just strength but patience, the kind that Mara had and Silas, she was learning, often didn't. He was a man who had spent years fighting his land instead of understanding it, throwing effort at problems without the underlying strategy that would make the effort stick. She could see it in the way he worked, hard, fast, with a kind of frustrated energy that accomplished a lot in the short term and undermined itself in the long run. She started redirecting him without making it look like that's what she was doing. If you hold that side while I set the notch, we get a better seat than if we both push from the same angle, she said, on the second pillar. He paused, moved, held his side, the notch seated perfectly. He didn't comment on it, but he moved to the correct side on the third pillar without being asked. Small things, but small things compounded. On the evening of the third day, with 2 pillars anchored and 2 yet to go, Mara sat on the edge of the trench, eating the cold dinner she'd packed dried meat and hard bread, and let herself think about Agnes for the first time in days. She didn't allow herself to do it often because it made her hands unsteady, and she couldn't afford unsteady hands. But sometimes it crept in anyway. The image of her grandmother in that small recovery room in Casper, the thin wool blanket, the sound of her breathing that had gotten wet and difficult over the past months. $40. She was so close to having a plan that would actually work. She just needed time. She was still sitting there when Ephraim Cole arrived. She heard the horse before she saw the man, a hard gallop from the direction of the main road, which meant urgency, which meant trouble. She stood up. A moment later, Silas appeared from the direction of the house, and a moment after that, Ephraim Cole pulled his horse up in the yard with an expression on his face that made Mara's stomach drop before he'd said a single word. "Storm's coming," Cole said. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a rancher's permanent squint. "Not a light one. I got word from the weather station at Holland. They're calling for a violent autumn deluge. Could be 6 inches of rain in 12 hours. It'll hit by morning." Mara looked at the open trench. 6 inches of rain in 12 hours. An open trench 12 feet deep. She did the math instantly, and the math was catastrophic. The trench would fill, the walls would liquefy, and all the work she'd done would become a mud collapse that would pull the already weakened barn wall down with it. She had 2 unset pillars. She turned to Silas. She could see him doing the same calculation. "We close the trench," he said. His voice was flat. "Certain. We cover it and retreat. We save what we've done and come back after." "If we do that," Mara said carefully, "the weight stays on the original substrate through a 6-inch rain event. The ground underneath is going to shift. The pillar anchors we already set could lose their load angle. We'd be starting over. Better to start over than lose the whole thing." "Silas," she waited until he looked at her. "If we retreat now, we're just buying ourselves more time on a problem that doesn't get easier with more time. The barn will keep failing. The next repair will fail. The one after that. This is the repair that actually fixes it, but only if we finish it. You're talking about working through the storm. I'm talking about finishing what we started." The silence between them was the kind that decisions get made in. And Silas Rourke looked at her, this young woman who had shown up at his door with worn-out boots and a dead man's notebook and more certainty than anyone he'd ever employed, and he said, "That's insane." "Probably," Mara agreed. "One person can't set those pillars in a rainstorm." "I know." He understood what she was saying. She watched him understand it, watched the moment it landed, the moment the choice became clear. Quiet for a long time. Then he looked at Ephraim Cole and said, "Go home, Ephraim. Get your stock under cover." Cole stared at him, silent. "Go home." Cole looked between them, shook his head slowly, and rode back the way he'd come. Silas Rourke turned back to Mara Ellison, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Blackthorn Ranch, there was nothing guarded in his expression. Just a man who had made a decision and was living with it. "All right," he said. "Tell me what we're doing. The rain started 2 hours later, and the real work, the hardest kind, the kind that cost something, was just beginning. The rain came the way Ephraim Cole had promised it would, not gradually, not with any of the slow warning that a reasonable storm offered, but all at once, like something had been cut loose overhead. Mara heard it hit the roof of the barn before she felt it on her skin, a sound like gravel being poured from a great height, and then the cold water was everywhere, soaking through her coat in the first minute, running down her collar, filling the grooves in the mud around her boots before she'd taken 3 steps toward the trench. She didn't hesitate. She climbed down into it. The trench was already changing. She could feel the walls softening under her fingers as she descended the rope she'd anchored to the fence posts, the shale and sand mixture absorbing water at a rate she'd calculated. But that was different to experience in the body. Water seeping through at ankle level, the smell of wet earth dense and close around her. She had maybe 4 hours before conditions became genuinely unworkable. Possibly less. Silas came down behind her 30 seconds later. He didn't ask what to do first. That surprised her. She'd expected him to arrive in the trench the way he did everything, with his own idea of the correct approach already formed and defended. Instead, he looked at the 2 unset pillars lying in the mud at the trench's edge, and then looked at her, and waited. That was the first real surprise Silas Rourke had given her. "Left pillar first," she said. "We seat it before the water rises another 2 inches, or we lose the notch angle." "How do we lift it?" "Lever and rope. I rigged it this morning in case we needed it. The rope's anchored at the top. You control the tension. I guide the base into the notch." "You rigged it this morning, before Cole arrived." He was quiet for a moment. "You already knew we might end up doing this." "I knew it was a possibility," Mara said. "I didn't know if you'd agree to it." He didn't respond to that. He found the rope, tested it with his weight, and nodded. "Tell me when." What followed was 40 minutes of the hardest physical work Mara had done in her life, and she'd set posts in frozen ground and hauled water up a hillside in summer heat, and once, during a particularly bad winter 3 years ago, helped her grandfather move a collapsed section of his neighbor's roof, using nothing but a timber lever and stubbornness. This was worse than all of it combined. The rain intensified halfway through the first pillar, driving sideways into the trench, and the mud at the base was moving, not catastrophically, not yet, but perceptibly, the way you feel a floor shift under your feet before you see the crack in the wall. The pillar weighed close to 200 pounds. Getting it vertical in a 12-foot trench during a rainstorm with 1 rope and 2 people required coordination that they didn't quite have and had to develop in real time, communicating in short sentences over the sound of water. "Hold, got it. Ease left, no my left. This much?" "More. Stop. Right there." The pillar base found the notch. Mara felt it seat, that solid, unambiguous drop into place that meant the geometry was right, and she jammed the wedge in with the flat of her palm 3 times until it held. She straightened up in the trench, breathing hard, her split palms burning where the rope had reopened them. Silas was looking at the seated pillar. His expression was unreadable in the rain and the dark. "1 down," he said. "1 down," she confirmed. They started on the second. The second was worse because the water level in the trench bottom had risen another 3 inches by the time they began, and because they'd used up whatever advantage the learning curve provided. The mud was active now. Mara could see the trench walls weeping silt, thin, dark rivulets running down the shale face, and she knew what that meant even if she didn't say it aloud. If the walls gave before they finished, the trench would close. They'd be buried up to the knee in shifting earth, and the pillars, the 2 seated ones, the work of 5 days, could lose their angle and become dead weight against a collapsing structure instead of support. She worked faster. Silas matched her pace without being asked. There was something strange happening in that trench in the dark and the cold and the rain, something Mara didn't have the attention to examine while it was occurring. She would think about it later, lying in dry clothes with her hands wrapped in clean cloth. But in the moment, all she knew was that Silas Rourke who had laughed at her on a porch 6 days ago, like she was the funniest thing he'd seen all year, was 3 feet away from her in 12 feet of mud, following her instructions with a focused competence that she hadn't expected and couldn't afford to waste. He didn't second-guess her. He didn't offer alternative approaches. He did exactly what the situation required, and he did it with a physicality that was genuinely useful, bracing the pillar against his shoulder when the rope tension wasn't enough, using his body as a counterweight when the base was drifting, throwing his full weight against the lever at the precise moment she called for it. The second pillar seated at just past midnight, Mara drove the wedge home. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain was still hammering the ground above them. Water was running through the trench at knee height now, cold enough that Mara's legs below the waterline had gone mostly numb. She was aware, distantly, that she was shaking not fear, just cold and exhaustion, expressing themselves through the body without permission. "We need to cap them," she said now. The water's still rising. "If we don't cap tonight, we cap in 4 feet of water tomorrow morning." Silas looked at the mud water level. He looked at the 2 pillars standing in the trench, solid and plumb, the lamplight catching the grain of the timber. Then he looked at her, and his face did something complicated that she didn't catch all of before it was gone. "Tell me what the cap requires," he said. 2 people and 12 bolts. The cap plate has to be dead level or the load transfer skews. How do you check level in a trench full of water at midnight? String line and a plumb bob. I have them in my kit. Another pause. "Of course you do," he said, and there was something in it. Not mockery anymore. Not even close to mockery. Something that sounded almost like he was talking to himself. They capped the pillars. It took another 2 hours. Mara's hands stopped burning somewhere in the middle of the first cap and went to a deep, cold ache that was in some ways easier to work through because it was less distracting. She focused on the string line, on the level, on the torque of each bolt. Silas held the plate steady without being told how hard to grip it, which she appreciated more than she said. They climbed out of the trench at just past 2 in the morning. Mara sat down in the mud at the trench's edge because her legs made that decision before she did. The rain had backed off slightly, still heavy, still loud, but no longer the sideways assault of 2 hours ago. She tipped her head back and felt cold water run down her face and didn't particularly care. Silas sat down 3 feet away, not close, not far. They were both filthy and wet and exhausted in the specific way that comes from spending your physical reserves all the way to the bottom. "Is it going to hold?" Silas said. Mara thought about it honestly. "The anchoring is sound. The caps are level. The timber is quality. Wherever you sourced it, it's good." She paused. "The question I can't answer tonight is the main crossbeam. What about it? I need to look at it in daylight. I had a concern before the storm started, and I didn't have time to investigate it properly." Silas was quiet. "What kind of concern?" "The kind that could change the plan," she said, and she said it flat, without softening it, because she'd learned early that softening problems for people was a form of lying that always cost you more than it saved. He didn't say anything to that. He sat in the mud in the rain and looked at the barn wall that had not moved during the storm, the wall that was still plumb, still standing, because of what they'd just done, and his jaw was set in that way she was beginning to recognize as him thinking, rather than refusing. For a while he said, "You should get inside. Get dry." "So should you, I will." She stood up, somewhat ungracefully. Her knees had opinions about the last 6 hours. She picked up her kit and started toward the ranch house, and she was halfway across the yard when he said her name. She stopped, turned. He was still sitting in the mud. He was looking at the barn, not at her. "You would have done it alone," he said. "If I hadn't agreed, you would have gone down there by yourself." It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," Mara said. He nodded slowly. "That's either very brave or very stupid. My grandfather said there usually wasn't much difference between the two." She didn't wait for a response. She went inside, found the dry clothes she'd left, folded on the bunkhouse bench, and changed in the dark. She rewrapped her hands with the last of the clean cloth. She lay down on the bunk and was asleep in under 2 minutes. She dreamed about Agnes. She dreamed about a warm room and clear water, and the particular sound her grandmother made when she laughed at something that genuinely surprised her, a sound Mara hadn't heard in months. She woke up before dawn. She went back out. The crossbeam was rotten. Not all of it. Not the full length, which would have meant the barn was beyond saving without a complete rebuild. Just the central section, 18 inches of timber that had been slowly failing for years, probably compromised by moisture, trapped between the beam and the original wall plate. From the outside it looked fine. Mara had run her hand along it the first morning she arrived at Blackthorn, and it had felt solid. But now, with the rain having come through the gaps in the roofline during the storm, with water pooling in places it hadn't pooled before, she pressed her thumbnail into the underside of the central section and felt it sink. She stood there for a long time looking at it. This was the problem with the original plan. Her brace design assumed a sound crossbeam to anchor to. You couldn't attach a structural brace to 18 inches of rot and expect anything other than eventual catastrophe. The brace would hold for a season, maybe 2. And then the connection point would fail, and the whole geometry she'd spent 5 days constructing would unravel from the center. She had to tear the wall apart to replace that section of beam. Tearing the wall apart meant temporarily removing the load support she'd just spent 2 days in a rainstorm installing, which meant the barn would be, for some period of time, more vulnerable than it had been before she started. She sat down on an overturned water trough and opened her grandfather's notebook to a blank page, the last blank page, as it happened, and started writing out what she knew. That was where Silas found her at 7 in the morning. He came into the barn, poured himself coffee from the pot she'd put on the small stove in the corner, and looked at her sitting on the trough with the notebook and a piece of charcoal. He didn't ask if she'd slept. He could see that she had. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He could see that too. The set of her shoulders said she was working a problem. He waited. "The crossbeam is rotten," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "How bad?" "Central 18 inches. It compromises the brace attachment." Silas set his coffee down. He walked to the beam and looked at it. She watched him press his thumb against the underside the same way she had, watched his expression when it sank. He stepped back. "What does that mean for the plan?" he said. "It means I have to revise it. Can it be revised?" She was honest with him, the way she'd been honest with him about everything. "I don't have an answer yet. I have a problem, and I'm working on it." He looked at the notebook page. She'd drawn the beam in cross-section, the pillar positions, the load angles. He wasn't an engineer, she could see that, but he was a man who'd spent 20 years managing physical structures. And she could see him reading the drawing with the part of his mind that understood weight and force, even if it didn't have the formal vocabulary. "What if you don't use the crossbeam at all?" he said. She looked up, "Say more." It was quiet. Thinking it through before he spoke, which she'd noticed he did. He wasn't a man who talked to fill space. Despite the evidence of their first conversation. The weight's going in the wall. It wants to push the wall out. What if instead of bracing from the beam, which is up here, he indicated the beam's height, you brace from the floor? Use the pillars as compression points and wedge something between them and the wall's base. The weight pushes out. The brace pushes back. The beam's not in it at all. Mara stared at him. She looked down at the drawing. She reached for the charcoal. The idea wasn't wrong. It was actually, she started sketching fast, the way she did when something was resolving rather than dissolving. It was a compression approach rather than a tension approach, which meant the force worked with the structure instead of against it, which meant the rotten beam became irrelevant because it was no longer a load-bearing connection point. The brace wouldn't need to attach to anything above the pillar caps. It would wedge between the granite-seated base and the wall's lowest timber course, transferring the wall's outward pressure down and back into the bedrock. It was more elegant than what she'd originally designed. She'd never have reached it without the rotten beam forcing her to abandon her first approach. She looked up. Silas was watching her with his arms crossed and an expression that was carefully not showing what it was. "That works," she said. "That's actually better than the original." He nodded. "Once. How'd you see that?" She said, "I've been watching what you do for 5 days. I understand the logic, even if I don't know the math." She looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, not as a problem to navigate or an obstacle to manage, but as a person. What she saw was a man who was smarter than he'd let anyone believe, probably including himself, and who had been applying that intelligence to the wrong problems for years. "This is going to require a compression brace that's bigger than anything I've built on this project," she said. "I'm going to need timber I don't have, and probably a day and a half to build it. I have timber in the lower barn. What dimensions?" She told him. He was gone for 20 minutes. He came back with 3 lengths of timber that were, as best she could measure them with her grandfather's rule, within a 1/4 inch of what she'd specified. She looked at the timber. She looked at him. "You keep good stock," she said. "I used to keep a better operation," he said, and the way he said it flat, uninflected, told her that the story behind that sentence was long and not one he was going to tell her today. She let it alone. They started building the compression brace. 2 days of work, as she'd estimated, though the second day bled into a third morning because the based seat required more precision than she'd initially calculated, and precision took the time it took regardless of urgency. Silas worked beside her for most of it, and they fell into a rhythm that Mara hadn't expected and couldn't quite describe. He had his ways of doing things, and so did she, and those ways were not always compatible, and they had disagreements, real ones, not polite ones. At one point on the second afternoon, she told him he was holding the brace wrong, and he told her that he'd been working timber since before she was born, and she told him that working timber since before she was born hadn't prevented his barn from falling down, and he stared at her for a hard second, and then adjusted his grip without another word. She felt bad about that one. She didn't apologize. There wasn't room for it, and she wasn't wrong. But that evening, she poured him a cup of coffee without being asked and left it where he'd find it. And when he found it, he looked at her for a moment and then drank it. And that was the closest either of them came to addressing it. There was a morning on the third day when Mara ran out of words and energy simultaneously, when the cold and the accumulated fatigue of the past week pressed down on her with a physicality that was almost hallucinatory. She sat against the barn wall with her knees pulled up and her eyes closed and tried to remember why $40 had seemed like enough motivation to walk 3 days across a Wyoming plain in October. She tried to bring Agnes's face to mind and found that what came instead was the sound of her breathing, that wet, difficult sound that meant things were getting worse rather than better. The sound that had sent Mara out the door with a satchel and a notebook and no plan except forward. She was still sitting there when Silas came around the corner of the barn and found her. He stopped. He looked at her. She looked back at him without moving. "I need 10 minutes," she said. "Take them," he said. He sat down against the barn wall 6 feet away, poured water from a canteen, drank some, and offered it to her. She took it. They sat in silence for a while, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised her because until about 4 days ago, she would have described every minute in Silas Rourke's vicinity as 1 degree away from confrontation. "You have someone waiting on this money," he said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't prying either. It was a statement that acknowledged something he'd put together on his own. She considered how to answer. "Yes, someone sick?" She looked at him sideways. "You work like you're running out of time," he said. "And not because of the snow." Mara was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother, she has a lung condition. There's a doctor in Casper who's been treating her, but he needs payment before winter sets in or She stopped. Edited. She needs to be in a warm room through the cold months. Silas didn't say anything immediately. He was looking at the middle distance, and his jaw had that set to it again. Not anger, she'd learned by now. Something else. Something older than anger. How long has she been ill? He said. 4 months seriously. She's been unwell for a while before that, but she declined when the weather turned. And there's nobody else? It's just the two of us. He was quiet for so long that Mara thought he was done with the conversation. Then he said, "My brother died in a winter like the one coming. He was 23. There was medicine that would have helped him, and I couldn't get it to him in time because of a storm." He said it without looking at her, said it with the kind of flatness that meant he'd decided to say it, and was saying it before he could change his mind. "I've been blaming this land ever since, blaming the ranch, blaming the weather, acting like if I could just fight it hard enough." He stopped. "The land wasn't why you lost him," Mara said carefully. "No," he said, "but it's easier to be angry at land than to be angry at luck." She understood that more than she could say. "For what it's worth," she said, after a moment, "what you did in that trench during the storm, the way you helped with the pillar seating, that wasn't fighting the land. That was understanding it." He looked at her. She held his gaze. "My grandfather used to say the difference between a man who loses everything and a man who keeps something is almost never about strength," Mara said. "It's about knowing when to push and when to let the weight work for you." Silas was quiet for a long time. "Your grandfather sounds like he was worth knowing." "He was the best person I've ever met," she said, and her voice held without cracking, which cost her something. "He died 2 years ago. Left me his notebook." "I know," Silas said. She looked at him sharply. "I've seen you with it every evening." He paused, and she could see him choosing the word with unusual care. "It's clear it matters." She looked down at her hands. The palms had healed enough to be functional, scarred enough to be permanent. "It's his handwriting in the margins," she said. "Every time I don't know what to do, I read his notes and I find not the answer exactly, but the way of thinking toward the answer." Silas looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded for 3 full seconds, which was the longest she'd seen him manage it. Then he stood up. "10 minutes is up," he said. She almost smiled. So it is, they went back to work. The compression brace came together on the morning of the 3rd day with a slowness that was maddening, and then, all at once, a completeness that was almost startling. The final piece was the main wedge, a tapered length of hardwood that had to be driven between the brace and the wall's base timber with enough force to create the compression load, but not so much that it split the contact point. Too little and the brace was decoration. Too much and you damaged the thing you were trying to save. Mara had measured the gap 4 times. She'd shaped the wedge herself over the course of an evening, running her grandfather's draw knife along the timber with the kind of focus that came from understanding that there was no margin here. The wedge was right or it wasn't, and right meant everything down to a 1/16 of an inch. The morning the brace was ready for final assembly, the sky above the Wyoming valley was the specific gray that preceded snow, not the ordinary gray of an overcast day, but a heavier, lower gray that smelled different and moved differently, and that every person who'd lived through a Wyoming winter recognized on the deep body level that has nothing to do with thought. Ephraim Cole arrived at the fence line at 8 in the morning. Not to help. He'd made his opinion of the whole enterprise clear enough, but it seemed to witness. "That's snow coming," he called across the yard. "I know," Silas said. "How long you think?" "Hours, maybe less." Cole shook his head. "You're both out of your minds," he said, but there was something in it that was less contempt than Mara would have expected. More the tone of a man watching something he doesn't understand and isn't sure yet what to think about it. She ignored him. She carried the wedge to the brace assembly and crouched to check the gap one final time. It was exactly what she'd measured. The timber faces were clean. The angle was correct. The pillar caps were still level. She checked those too, running the string line while Silas held the plumb bob without being asked, because he'd watched her do it often enough to know what the process required. "Ready," she said. "Ready," he said. She drove the first mallet strike. The wedge moved a 1/4 inch, second strike. Another 1/4 inch. Timber creaked, not the bad kind of creak, the kind that meant something was failing. but the loaded sound of a structure accepting force, compressing, adjusting to a new reality. Third strike. The wall moved. Not much, not dramatically, not in the way that would make a watching man shout or step back. But Mara felt it. The barely perceptible return of the left wall's lean, the straightening that was less a movement than a settling, like something that had been holding its breath finally released it. She drove the wedge home with 2 more strikes, then she stopped. She stood up. She put her hand flat against the wall. Still, she pressed her palm harder, waited. Nothing shifted. Nothing moved. The wall was bearing its load downward through the compression brace into the pillar, caps into the granite and cord bases, and down 12 feet into bedrock, exactly as she'd calculated, exactly as her father's principles predicted. The wall held. Silas was standing behind her. She turned around. He was looking at the wall. His jaw was set. His arms were at his sides. He was looking at the barn wall with an expression that she would have called, if she were being precise about it, the expression of a man who had been proved wrong about something he'd believed for a long time. Not wrong in a shaming way, but wrong in a way that changed the available options. The look of a closed door opening. "It worked," he said. His voice was quiet. "Yes, you knew it would. I believed it would," she corrected. "There's a difference." He looked at her then. Really looked. Not the measuring look he'd had when she arrived, not the waiting for her to fail look he'd carried for the first several days. Something that had been decided, behind his eyes, without his face quite catching up to it yet. "There's still the well," he said. "I know, you have a plan for that too." "I have the beginning of one." Cole's voice came from the fence line, quieter than before. "I'll be damned," he said. He was looking at the barn wall. Mara didn't know how long he'd been watching, or exactly when his expression had shifted, but it had. He was looking at the barn wall with the focused attention of a man who knew structures and was seeing something he hadn't expected. That left wall was 6 inches out of plumb last month. 7.5, Mara said. Cole looked at her. Then he looked at the wall. Then he looked at Silas. Silas looked back at him steadily. Cole shook his head slowly, but this time it wasn't dismissal. It was something closer to the headshake of a man recalibrating. He turned his horse without another word and rode back toward his property, and Mara watched him go and thought about the difference between a man who sees something new and accepts it and one who sees something new and finds reasons to deny it. The snow started 2 hours later. Light at first, the testing kind, and then steadier, in the way Wyoming snow committed to itself once it got started. Mara stood in the yard with her face tipped up and felt the first flakes on her skin and ran the inventory in her head. Barn, done foundation, sound compression brace, holding. Well, still contaminated, still to be done. $40 not yet earned. Agnes still waiting. She brought herself back to the ground. Inside the barn, out of the snow, she found her grandfather's notebook and opened it to the last page, the one she'd written on the morning after the storm, the compression brace sketches. Below her sketches, on the last inch of white space left in the book, she wrote 3 words in her own handwriting. Then she closed it. What she'd written was, he saw it. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected a man who'd laughed at her on a porch to climb into a trench in a rainstorm with her, to see a structural solution she'd missed, to sit in silence beside her against a barn wall and tell her about his dead brother without being asked. She hadn't expected Silas Rourke to be what he was turning out to be. She hadn't planned for it. She didn't know yet what to do with it. She tucked the notebook back in her satchel. She went to look at the well. The snow fell on Blackthorn Ranch, the way it always did in this part of Wyoming, without apology and without consideration for whether the people below were ready for it. The barn stood motionless against the flurries. The fence posts held their lines. Inside the ranch house, a lamp burned in the kitchen window, visible from the yard, casting a yellow rectangle onto the freshening snow. Mara looked at it once as she crossed the yard, then looked away. She had a well to fix, and the money she'd come for, and a grandmother who was counting on her to finish what she'd started. She picked up her kit and got to work. The well was a different kind of problem. Everything Mara had done to the barn involved things she could see and measure and calculate load paths, timber dimensions, geological depth. The well was hidden work. The contamination was happening somewhere she couldn't directly observe, in the gap between what was visible and what was actually occurring underground, and that gap was where the problem lived. She'd been thinking about it since her first morning at Blackthorn Ranch, when she'd drawn a bucket of water and held it up to the light and watched the way it caught, a faint reddish-brown tint, almost imperceptible unless you knew what you were looking for, and the smell beneath the cold that was metallic and wrong in the specific way of mineral contamination rather than biological. Her grandfather had written extensively about water systems in the notebook. He'd worked on 3 different properties in his life where well contamination had caused illness, and his notes on the subject were careful and precise and organized in the way all his notes were, with the solution methodology written separately from the diagnosis methodology, because he believed that conflating the two was how people ended up treating symptoms instead of causes. She'd read those sections 3 times in the first week. The diagnosis was not complicated, as it turned out. The well casing had cracked probably during a freeze cycle 2 or 3 years back, and the crack had allowed surface runoff containing iron and manganese deposits from the shale shelf above the property to migrate into the water column. The contamination wasn't dangerous in the acute sense, not at the concentrations present, but it was steadily worsening as the crack widened. And within another season or 2, it would be bad enough to affect livestock health and eventually make the water genuinely unusable. The solution required a clay-lined barrier installed around the well casing at the depth of the crack, which meant partially excavating the well surround, locating the crack precisely, and packing the barrier material in layers that would cure watertight before the freeze fully locked the ground. The problem was time. Clay barriers required a minimum curing period before they could be tested and relied upon. The exact duration depended on temperature and soil moisture conditions, and both of those variables were now moving in the wrong direction simultaneously. Every day the temperature dropped brought the ground closer to frozen, and frozen ground meant a barrier that had cured at the wrong rate brittle in some places, incompletely set in others, likely to fail under the pressure differentials of a hard winter. Mara sat at the kitchen table that evening with her grandfather's notebook open and a stub of candle burning beside her, and worked through the calculations 3 times because the first 2 produced an answer she didn't like, and she wanted to be sure she wasn't making an error. She wasn't making an error. She had approximately 8 days. Possibly 9 if the temperature held, but she didn't have confidence in that. She heard Silas come in from the yard, heard him pull off his boots at the door the way he always did, heard the particular sound of his movement through the house that she'd catalogued without intending to over the past 10 days. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at her, looked at the notebook, and poured himself water from the pitcher, the clean water she'd been hauling from the creek a quarter-mile away since her first day, because she'd refused to drink from the contaminated well, regardless of how inconvenient the alternative was. 8 days, she said, before he could ask. He set the pitcher down. For what? For the clay barrier to cure adequately before the ground freezes. He was quiet for a moment. And the excavation? 3 days, maybe 4 if the ground's already harder than it looks. Which means I start tomorrow and I don't stop until it's done. Silas sat down at the table across from her. He didn't ask if she was sure. He'd stopped asking that somewhere around day 4, she'd noticed as if at some point he'd simply updated his operating assumption from "she probably doesn't know what she's doing" to "let's hear what she thinks and then decide." "What do you need?" he said. She told him. It was a longer list than the barn had required. Post hole digger, flat space, access to the clay deposits she'd located in the creek bank about 200 yards east of the property line, 2 lengths of wooden pipe for relining the upper casing, a quantity of gravel for the drainage layer. And this was the part she hadn't figured out entirely. Samion, who could work the excavation from the inside while she directed from above. because the geometry of the well surround meant that the most critical portion of the clay packing had to be done from below grade, in a space about 2 feet across, with hands rather than tools. That's a small space, Silas said. Yes, you'd fit. I know, but someone needs to be above to manage the material and the rope system. The person below needs both hands free. He looked at her steadily across the table. You're going to spend time inside a well, a partially excavated well surround. Not the well shaft itself. That's a meaningful distinction? Yes, she said. One of them I can get out of quickly if something goes wrong. The other one, she paused. I won't be in the shaft. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the candle burned down a noticeable fraction. All right, he said finally. I'll manage from above. She looked at him. You're sure? You're the one going in the hole, Ellison. I think you're the one who gets to decide if you're sure. She almost smiled. Not quite, but it was close. And he saw it, and something in his expression shifted slightly in response. Not a smile exactly, but the muscle near the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was adjacent to one. I'm sure, she said. She went to bed. She slept 5 hours, which was more than she'd managed most nights since arriving, and woke up before first light feeling the specific unease of someone who has calculated a problem correctly and doesn't like the answer. She got up and started digging. The first day of excavation was straightforward in the way that terrible things sometimes are at the beginning, before they've had time to reveal their full dimensions. The ground around the well surround was cold, but not yet frozen at depth. She'd tested it the previous day and found good penetration to about 16 inches, which was enough to start. She worked the flat spade in a ring around the stone surround, pulling the disturbed material back and piling it carefully, because she'd need to replace it in layers once the barrier was set. Silas worked beside her without complaint, moving material in the wheelbarrow to a staging area 10 feet away, keeping the work zone clear. He'd developed a habit over the past several days of watching what she was doing with a focused attention that wasn't supervision. It wasn't the attention of a man looking for mistakes or waiting to offer corrections. It was the attention of someone who was genuinely trying to understand the method. She'd caught him twice examining joints in the barn brace at close range when he thought she wasn't watching, running his fingers along the connection points the way her grandfather used to do when he was memorizing how something worked. By the end of the first day, they were down to 22 inches across the full ring, and Mara had located the crack in the well casing. It was exactly where she'd predicted it would be based on the surface runoff patterns on the uphill side of the casing, at a depth of about 18 inches, running roughly 4 inches along the stone. She photographed it in her mind, turned it over in her mind, measured it with her fingers the way a doctor measures a wound. Found it, she called up. Silas appeared at the rim of the excavation, crouching. How bad? Manageable, she said. 4 inches long, maybe 3 millimeters at the widest point. It'll seal. You sound surprised. I'm relieved, she corrected. There's a difference. He handed down the canteen. She drank, handed it back, and went back to cleaning the crack face with the small brush she'd brought for the purpose. The crack had to be clean before the barrier clay went in. Any debris between the clay and the casing face would create a pathway for water to migrate around the seal. She worked until the light was genuinely gone, and she couldn't see well enough to be certain of what she was doing. Silas was still at the rim when she signaled to be brought up, which meant he'd been there in the cold for the last hour of the day, doing nothing except being available in case she needed something. She noticed that and filed it away without commenting on it. He pulled her up with the rope she'd rigged to a fence post, bracing his feet against the stone surround, and when she got to the rim and swung her legs over onto solid ground, she sat there for a moment, breathing the cold air that suddenly seemed enormous after the close dark of the hole. You eat anything today? Silas said. She thought about it. Breakfast, that was 10 hours ago, I know. He made a sound that wasn't quite exasperated, but was in that neighborhood, and went to the house, and came back 20 minutes later with food that was hot. which she hadn't expected. A bowl of something that was beans and salt pork, and probably some other things she couldn't identify in the dark. But it was hot, and it was substantial, and she ate all of it sitting on the ground next to the excavated well surround without any self-consciousness about it. He sat nearby and ate his own bowl and didn't talk, which she'd come to understand was not the silence of a man with nothing to say, but the silence of one who was comfortable without filling it. After a while, he said, "Ephraim Cole stopped by this afternoon while you were down." She looked up. What did he want? He wanted to look at the barn. A pause. He brought his son. Boy's about 17. Wanted to show him the brace. Mara was quiet for a moment. Did he say anything about it? He said Silas stopped. Seemed to reconsider. He said he'd never seen that approach to a compression load in a barn setting. Said he thought it was clever. Did he say who he thought had done it? Silas looked at her steadily. He asked me. I told him it was your design. All of it. She went back to her food. The wind had come up from the northwest, and it had teeth in it, and she pulled her coat tighter. What did he say to that? She said. He said, huh. High praise. For Ephraim Cole, it might actually be. She finished the bowl, set it down. The wind moved the dry grass at the edge of the yard, and the sky above was fully dark now, the kind of dark that came with no moon and no clouds, just cold and stars. 6 more days, she said. I know, the clay has to go in tomorrow. I need it in place and tamped before the temperature drops any further. I'll have the clay from the creek bank by first light, he said. I'll go tonight. She looked at him. Going to the creek bank in the dark in this wind to dig clay. It was a solid hour of unpleasant work in conditions that were getting worse. You don't have to do it tonight, she said. You need it by first light. Creek's a 1/4 mile. I'll go tonight. She opened her mouth and closed it again. She'd been about to argue, and she could see there was no argument to make. He'd already done the same arithmetic she had and reached the same conclusion, and he was simply stating what was required. Take the good lantern, she said. The small one has a short wick. He took the good lantern. She heard him leave the yard an hour later. The creak of the wheelbarrow, his boots on the frozen grass, and she lay in the bunkhouse and listened to the sounds fade toward the creek and thought about the distance between who she'd thought Silas Rourke was and who he was turning out to be. The distance was considerable. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that. The clay went in over 2 days. It was the worst work of the entire project, confined, cold, physically demanding in the specific way of work that required both strength and delicacy, where too much force in the wrong moment ruined what you'd just spent an hour building. The clay had to be packed in layers, each layer tamped to a specific density before the next went on, and the confinement of the well surround meant that Mara was working in a position that was hard on her lower back and both knees, twisted to reach the crack face, and the cold coming off the stone was the penetrating kind that went through gloves and cloth and settled in the joints. She didn't stop. Silas managed the material from above, lowering clay in measured batches by rope bucket, hauling waste material back up, keeping the water from a barrel of clean water she'd specified flowing in a controlled way to maintain the correct consistency in the clay she was working. He'd learned, over the 2 days, exactly how much material she needed at each stage without being told each time, adjusting to her rhythm with the same focused competence he'd shown in the trench during the storm. On the afternoon of the second day, 7 feet down, her left hand slipped on the wet clay face, and her knuckles connected hard with the stone casing. She felt the skin tear. She didn't look at it. She couldn't afford the angle, and pressed on. The blood made the clay slippery, which was inconvenient. Ellison, Silas's voice from above. I'm fine, you're bleeding. I know, it's not serious. A pause. She could hear him deciding whether to push it. He decided against it, which was the right call, and lowered the next bucket of clay without another word. She finished the layer she was working on, tamped it, started the next. Somewhere in the middle of the third tamping layer, with the light going gray above her and her arms gone to pure fatigue weight and her knees genuinely complaining now, she had the thought sudden, and without warning, that she was going to make it. Not just the well, not just the $40. She was going to make it back to Agnes with money and time left, and she was going to get her grandmother through this winter. She felt it in her body before she felt it in her mind, some physical certainty, and she stopped for a full 30 seconds, just breathing in the cold dark of the excavation, with her hands pressed flat as clay and let herself feel it. She'd allowed herself very few moments like that. They were dangerous if you spent them too early. This one felt earned. She went back to work. They pulled her up at dusk on the second clay day, and Mara sat on the ground at the well's edge and looked at her hands and took inventory. Knuckles torn and clay-crusted, both palms re-split along the original cracks from the trench work. Her left wrist had a deep ache that might be a strain, or might be something she'd decide wasn't serious and deal with later. Silas crouched in front of her with a piece of cloth he'd wetted with clean water and looked at the knuckles. "Let me see the wrist," he said. "It's fine, Ellison." She looked at him. "Let me see the wrist," he said again, the same tone, neither harder nor softer. She extended it. He pressed 2 fingers along the underside, then the top, watching her face rather than her wrist, which told her he understood that pain response was the better diagnostic than visual inspection. She kept her face neutral, which required some effort. "Can you make a fist?" he said. She made one. "Hurt?" "Some. Strained, not broken," he said. "You'll want to wrap it tonight." "I know how to wrap a wrist. I know you do." He sat back on his heels. He didn't release her wrist immediately, held it for just a moment longer, not gripping it, just present, and then let it go and stood up. "Curing starts now," she said. "I need 6 days minimum." 7 to be safe. The well's going to be out of use for that long? "We keep hauling from the creek." "I know I've been hauling water since before you got here," he said. 6 more days is 6 more days. She looked at him. "You've been hauling water since before I got here because the well's contaminated." "Yes." "How long has it been contaminated?" He was quiet. 3 years. About. 3 years of hauling water from a creek a quarter-mile away. 3 years of knowing the well was wrong and not having a solution and watching the problem get incrementally worse. She thought about what that kind of ongoing failure did to a man who was already fighting everything: the barn, the finances, the land itself. What it did to his sense of whether things could be fixed at all. "The crack probably started in the freeze of '86, she said. "If you'd caught it then, it would have been a half-day job." "I know that now. She paused. "I'm not criticizing you. I'm saying it's the kind of thing that looks simple in hindsight. Most things do." He looked at her with that careful measuring quality. "You're letting me off the hook. I'm giving you accurate information." "It's the same thing." "It really isn't," she said. He almost laughed. She heard it, a breath, a shift in his face, before he caught it and filed it back somewhere. She'd heard versions of it twice before. Both times he'd caught it before it became a full thing. She wondered what it cost him to keep doing that. The curing days were strange. After weeks of driving physical work, the well barrier required nothing from Mara except time and vigilance, checking the temperature twice daily, monitoring the soil moisture around the excavation, keeping the site covered with the canvas she'd weighted with stones to hold in warmth. It was weighting work, which was in some ways harder than digging work, because it gave her brain space she hadn't had, and her brain immediately filled that space with things she'd been not thinking about. Agnes was the constant, but something else was beginning to intrude. She repaired the north fence line on the 3rd curing day because she had time and because the fence needed it, and because she didn't know how to be on a property and see something broken without addressing it if she had the means to. Silas found her there at mid-morning and looked at the 3 posts she'd already replaced and the 2 she was working on. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "It needed doing." "It's not part of the agreement." She drove a staple into the new post. "I know." He watched her work for a moment. "Why?" She thought about it. "Because I fix things," she said. "Just what I do. I see a problem and I can't look away from it." She paused. "My grandmother says it's a character flaw. Your grandmother sounds like she might be wrong about that one." Mara smiled, a real one, not contained in time, and for a moment the yard was quiet and the snow was light in the air, and the wind had backed off to something almost gentle. She caught Silas looking at her the moment afterward. Not with the measuring assessment she'd gotten used to. Something different, harder to categorize. She'd have called it unguarded, except that she didn't think Silas Frusk did unguarded. Not really. Not yet. She went back to the fence. He picked up the spare staple driver without asking and started on the next post. They finished the north fence line by early afternoon. On the fourth curing day, she found him in the barn, sitting on the work trough with her grandfather's notebook open in his hands. He'd picked it up from where she'd left it on the trough rim. She'd been looking at the compression brace earlier, checking that the first snow hadn't affected the timber, and he was reading it. He looked up when she came in, and he didn't do the thing some people did when caught with something that wasn't theirs. He didn't close it quickly, or look guilty, or explain himself. He just looked at her. "I should have asked," he said. "Yes," she said. He held it out. She took it. He said, "Your grandfather wrote a note in the margin of the well section. He wrote, 'The water doesn't follow the contamination back to the source, not forward to the symptom.' What did he mean by that?" She was a little surprised he'd asked. She sat down on the opposite end of the trough. He meant that most people treat what they can taste or smell, the symptom instead of finding where the contamination enters the system. If you only treat the symptom, the problem keeps producing new symptoms. You have to go upstream. Silas was quiet for a moment. "That's not just about water." "No," she said. He applied it to most things. He looked at the barn wall, the left wall, now plumb, now still. "I've been treating symptoms on this ranch for 7 years. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The barn, the fences, the water. I kept fixing what was visible. He said it without apparent self-pity more, the tone of someone reciting facts they'd recently verified. Every time something failed, I put money and time into the repair, and 6 months later, the same thing failed again. And I thought the land was just relentless. That it just kept coming. The land is relentless, she said. But that's not the same as the land being the problem." He looked at her. "No," he said, "it's not." There was a silence that was the kind you don't fill. Then he said, "I looked at the medical bill." Mara went very still. "It was in your satchel," he said, the outside pocket. "I wasn't going through your things. It was partly visible when you left the satchel on the bench. I saw the doctor's name and he stopped. I'm sorry." "That wasn't my right." She was quiet for a long moment. "What did you see enough?" She looked at the floor. The response in her chest to this was complicated half embarrassment at the exposure, and half something else, something that was closer to the feeling of a weight shared than a weight taken, which she hadn't expected. "The $40 covers it," she said. "Mostly. There may be a small amount remaining, but I have a plan for that." "What kind of plan?" "The kind where I figure out the next thing after I've finished the current thing." He looked at her steadily. "That's not much of a plan." "It's gotten me this far." He didn't have a response to that which she appreciated. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known. Sitting in that barn on the fourth curing day with her grandfather's notebook in her lap and the barn wall holding solid behind her, was that Silas had left the barn immediately after she'd gone to the fence line that morning and had gone to the ranch house and spent an hour at the kitchen table looking at numbers. His own numbers. The state of his finances, which were not robust, but which were not as destroyed as he sometimes told himself they were. He'd been telling himself the worst version for so long that he'd stopped checking if the worst version was still accurate. She didn't know that he'd made a decision in that hour. She wouldn't find out for 3 more days. On the 6th curing day, Mara woke up to 2 things simultaneously: the sound of wind that had changed character overnight, and the absence of the light snow that had been falling intermittently. She went outside in the gray pre-dawn and put her hand in the soil at the edge of the canvas-covered excavation and felt it. The temperature had dropped harder than forecast. Not devastating. Not yet. But the 7-day cure she'd hoped for was now a 6-day cure whether she liked it or not. because tomorrow the ground would be too cold to evaluate the barrier integrity accurately, and she needed to test before that happened. She went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then she went and knocked on Silas's door. He opened it faster than a man who'd been asleep would have, which meant he'd been awake. He was dressed. Temperature dropped, she said. I know. I checked an hour ago. I need to test the well today. Not tomorrow. Today. He looked at her. He knew what that meant. The cure was a day short. The barrier might be adequate, and they wouldn't know until the water came up. And if it wasn't adequate, then they were starting over in conditions that made starting over nearly impossible. What's the actual risk of testing a day early? He said. If the clay hasn't fully consolidated at the lower layers, the test draw could disrupt it. We'd have a partial barrier that looked adequate until the freeze-thaw cycle worked on it. And if we wait, the ground freezes. We can't test at all until spring. And we don't know if the barrier held through winter until the water quality tells us, by which point we've either been drawing contaminated water all winter or we've been hauling from the creek for 6 more months. He was quiet for a moment. What's your gut tell you? She looked at him. He'd asked that before. What she thought, what she felt, what she believed rather than what she could prove. It was a habit she'd noticed, and that continued to surprise her, coming from a man who'd spent years ignoring everything he couldn't fight directly. My gut says the lower layers set faster than they should have because the clay I used from the creek bank had a higher sand content than ideal, she said. Which sounds like a problem, but actually means the consolidation was mechanical rather than purely chemical. It's probably adequate, probably. Yes, but you don't know. No, I won't know until I see the water. Another pause. The wind hit the side of the house and the kitchen window rattled. We test today, he said. She'd already known he was going to say that. She'd known it in the moment he'd agreed to help with the second pillar in the trench during the storm, in the moment he'd sat against the barn wall and told her about his brother, in the moment he'd come back from the creek bank in the dark with a wheelbarrow full of clay. She'd known what kind of man he was, not the kind she'd met on the porch on that first afternoon, but the kind that had been there all along under the years of hardship and loss and fighting the land instead of understanding it. She just hadn't been sure he knew it yet. I'll get the bucket, she said. They cleared the canvas from the excavation and rebuilt the draw system Mara had modified, a longer rope to account for the excavated depth, a wider bucket to get an adequate sample volume. The sky above them was that heavy gray again, lower than yesterday, and the wind was coming in from the north with a consistency that said it wasn't going anywhere. Mara lowered the bucket. She counted the rope in her hands as it descended 12 feet of excavation, plus another 20 to the water table, and she felt the bucket reach water by the change in the rope's behavior, the slight release as the bucket began to fill. She looked at Silas. He was looking at the well. She drew the bucket up slowly, hand over hand, keeping the pull steady. She could feel by the weight when the bucket cleared the water table and started coming through the clay barrier zone, and the rope ran through her hands without catching no resistance, no disturbance, nothing to suggest the clay had moved or disrupted under the draw. The bucket appeared at the rim. Mara lifted it over and held it up. The light was gray and flat and not ideal, so she carried the bucket 3 paces to where she'd left the clean lantern and held it close. Clear, not almost clear, clear. The kind of water that had no tint, no shimmer, no trace of the reddish brown that had been in every draw she'd taken from this well since arriving at Blackthorn Ranch. She smelled it, cold and mineral and clean. She drank from her cupped palm. No rust, no bitterness, just water. She stood there for a moment with the cold water dripping from her chin and felt something happen in her chest. Not triumph exactly, which was too proud a word for it, and not relief exactly, which was too passive. Something that combined both and added something else, something that had to do with Agnes and her grandfather and 3 days walking across a Wyoming plain with worn-out boots, something that had to do with what it cost to bet everything on your own understanding of a problem and be right. turned around. Silas was there. He was watching her face, not the bucket. He'd seen whatever had crossed her expression in that moment, and his own face was doing something she'd never seen it do before open. Fully open, not performing and not guarded. Just a man seeing something he hadn't expected and being moved by it in a way he couldn't entirely contain. She said, "The water's clean." He said, "I can see that." She said, "We're done," he said quietly. So quietly she almost didn't catch it over the wind, yes. And then they were both just standing there at the edge of the open well, with the clean water in the bucket and the wind coming hard out of the north and the barn standing solid and plumb 30 yards away. What happened next came before either of them said anything else. He put his hand on her shoulder, not the way you comfort someone, not the way you steady someone, just contact, the kind that acknowledged without explaining itself. And she didn't move away from it, and they stood like that for about 10 seconds, which was, Mara thought afterward, longer than it probably looked from the outside and shorter than it felt from inside it. Then she stepped forward and lifted the bucket and said, "We should refill the holding barrel." "Yes," he said. She drew 3 more buckets before she let herself stop. On the 4th draw, she sat down on the stone surround and looked at the barn and the fence line and the way the property looked different than it had the morning she'd arrived. Not in the obvious ways, the structural ones, but in some quality of the light or the solidity of things, some property she couldn't name that had changed. And then she thought about what happened next. She had $40 coming. She had Agnes waiting. She had a 3-day walk back to Casper. The thought of leaving sat in her chest in a way she examined briefly and then set aside, because there was nothing to be done with it yet, and because examining it too closely felt like the kind of thing she couldn't afford until the money was in her hand and her grandmother was warm. She pulled the last bucket, capped the well, and folded the canvas. Behind her, the first real snow of winter began to fall. The snow that had started as something gentle and provisional did not stay that way. By the time Mara had folded the canvas and carried her tools back to the barn, the flakes had thickened to the kind that stuck rather than melted, accumulating on the fence posts and the roof ridge and the window ledges in a way that said this wasn't a passing weather event. This was winter making its intention known. The sky had gone from heavy gray to the particular white gray that people in this part of Wyoming learned to read as seriously, not a test. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment and watched it come down. Barn behind her was solid, the well was clean. The north fence line was repaired. She had done what she'd said she would do, in the time she'd said she would do it, and the evidence of it surrounded her in every direction she looked. She should have felt finished. What she actually felt was the cold moving through her coat and the thought of Agnes and 3 days of walking in this, and the complicated knowledge that she was not, in fact, finished because finishing meant leaving. And leaving meant the walk to Casper, and the walk to Casper in a building Wyoming blizzard was a different proposition than the walk she'd made out here 3 weeks ago in merely cold and difficult weather. She went to find Silas. He was in the ranch house, at the kitchen table, and there was something on the table in front of him that she registered without fully processing until she was halfway across the room, a small stack of bills, paper currency, organized and weighted down with a smooth riverstone that she recognized from the windowsill. He'd been using it as a doorstop. He looked up when she came in. She stopped. "Sit down," he said. "Silas, sit down, Ellison." Please, she sat. She looked at the bills. She looked at him. "Count it," he said. She didn't move immediately. The word please had caught her because she hadn't heard him use it before except in the most transactional sense, and this hadn't been transactional. She counted it. $40. Exactly $40. In denominations that suggested he'd given genuine thought to the counting, not a single large note, which would have required change and delay, and the possibility that the apothecary in Casper might claim not to have it, but a combination of bills that were practically exchangeable anywhere. He'd thought about the practicalities of her situation. She set the money down. The agreement was payment when the work was done, she said. The well The well has clean water in it, he said. I drew a bucket myself an hour ago. The work is done. She looked at him. The clay may need additional monitoring through the first hard freeze. Then tell me what to monitor, and I'll monitor it. Silas Mara. He said her first name, and she realized it was the first time he'd used it without the slight formality of her surname. It didn't sound strange. That was what surprised her. It sounded like something that had always been accurate, only recently deployed. Take the money. You earned it. The agreement was clear, and so was your side of it. She looked at the bills again, the stone on top of them. Outside, the snow was picking up. She could hear the change in the wind against the windows. I need to get back to Casper, she said. Today, if possible. Before this gets worse. The silence after that sentence had a quality she couldn't quite read. Silas looked at the window. He looked at the snow the way a man looks at something he has strong feelings about and is choosing his words around. How far did you make it coming out? He said. 3 days. In October weather. Yes, he stopped. Recalibrated. That's not a walk I'd send anyone on today. Not in what's coming. I'm not asking you to send me. I'm telling you I need to go. I understand that. His voice was steady and flat, and she could hear him working to keep it that way. I'm telling you that what's coming today is not October weather. What's coming today could close the Holland Creek crossing by tomorrow morning, which means anyone caught on the road between here and Casper is either pinned down at a homestead or in real trouble. She looked at the window. She'd been watching the snow. She knew he wasn't wrong. She also knew that every hour between now and when she reached Agnes was an hour that things could change. Dr. Heller was a patient man, but he'd been patient for 4 months, and patient men had limits that you didn't always know about until you found them. And Agnes had been declining in October. She had no reliable information about how Agnes was doing now, in November, in the beginning of what was shaping up to be a hard winter. Her hands tightened in her lap. There has to be a way, she said, and she heard it, the crack in it, the first crack since she'd arrived at Blackthorn Ranch. She hadn't meant for it to come out like that. It came from somewhere she'd been keeping sealed. Silas heard it too. He looked at her with an expression that had no performance in it at all. There is a way, he said. I have a horse that can make that road in conditions that would stop a person on foot. I've done the Casper run in early winter before. I know where the shelter points are if it gets bad. We leave within the hour. We have a real chance of making it before the crossing becomes a problem. Stared at him. You'd take me? Yes. She stopped. That's 2 days round trip in a blizzard for someone who's not your responsibility. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful in the way of someone moving around something fragile. I had a brother, he said. I've told you that. I had a brother who needed medicine, and I didn't get it to him in time because I told myself the weather was the obstacle and there was nothing to be done about weather. He looked at the table. The weather wasn't the obstacle. I was. I told myself a story about why it wasn't possible, and I believed it because believing it was easier than what the alternative required. The room was quiet except for the wind. I'm not doing that again, he said. Not if there's a choice, and right now there's a choice. She looked at him for a long time. She said, I'll get my satchel. They left within the hour, as he'd said. The horse was a gray gelding named Cutter who was, as Silas had implied, built for exactly this kind of work broad through the chest, calm in a way that was trained rather than natural, with the short coupled stride of an animal that could maintain its footing in conditions that would send a taller horse stumbling. Mara rode behind Silas on the gelding's back with her satchel across her front and her hands not quite holding his coat, not gripping it, just present at the level of his back pocket, available if the horse shifted. The snow was already several inches deep when they left the ranch yard, and it was falling faster than it had been an hour ago. Silas set a pace that was neither reckless nor tentative measured, the pace of someone who understood the distance and the conditions, and had calculated what the horse could sustain without being pushed past its reliable performance. He knew this road. She could feel it in the way he held the reins, not tight, Not loose, just present. Making small adjustments she could feel through his back rather than see. They didn't talk much. The wind made conversation an effort, and both of them understood that effort was being conserved for other things. An hour into the ride, the road dropped into the creek valley, and Mara could see the Holland Creek crossing ahead. The water was higher than it had been when she'd crossed it on the way out. She'd waded it shin-deep in October, and it had been cold but passable. Now it was bank-full and running fast and dark with snowmelt from the hills above, and the ford that had been marked with 2 stacked stones on either bank was half submerged on the downstream side. Silas pulled Cutter up at the bank and looked at it for a moment. "It's crossable," he said, "but I want you to hold on properly." "I am holding on. You're near holding on. I need actually holding on." "Put your arms around my waist." She hesitated for exactly 1 second, not because she objected, but because the instruction was direct in a way that acknowledged something that neither of them had been acknowledging directly. She put her arms around his waist. "Good," he said, and urged Cutter into the crossing. The horse entered the water without hesitation, which was the quality Mara cared most about. In that moment, an animal that hesitated at a water crossing could be managed, but it cost time and warmth and certainty, and she had limited reserves of all 3. Cutter walked into the flow with his ears forward, and his stride unchanged, found the footing of the submerged ford by some combination of training and instinct, and carried them across in 12 steps. The water came up to his belly on the deepest part. It soaked Mara's boots to the ankle and her lower legs to the knee, and was the kind of cold that made her gasp despite herself. But they were through, and Cutter climbed the opposite bank without breaking stride, and the road to Casper opened ahead of them through falling snow. Mara's arms stayed where they were for a few minutes after the crossing. Then she moved them back to their previous position. Neither of them mentioned it. They made the halfway point a homestead belonging to a family called Brenner that Silas knew from years of doing this route by early afternoon. The Brenners were a practical frontier family who took one look at the weather and the horse and the 2 snow-covered travelers and opened their door without being asked. The wife, a compact woman of about 50 who moved through her kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd been feeding travelers in bad weather for decades, put coffee and food on the table before Mara had finished pulling off her wet boots. Her name was Ruth Brenner, and she looked at Mara across the table with the direct appraisal of a woman who had no time for pretense and said, "Blackthorn?" Mara looked at her. "Yes. I heard Rourke finally had somebody working on the property who actually knew what they were doing." She said it without looking at Silas, who was across the room talking to her husband. "Where did you hear that?" Mara said. "Ephraim Cole told my husband." Which means Ephraim Cole went out of his way to say something complimentary about a woman doing ranch work, which means what you did must have been genuinely something. She refilled Mara's coffee without being asked. "He's not a generous man with credit," no, Mara agreed. "He's not." Ruth Brenner looked at her with the kind of attention that was assessing but not unkind. "And you're leaving?" It wasn't a question. "I need to reach Casper," Mara said. "Grandmother is ill." Ruth nodded, accepting this the way a practical person accepts facts. "Rourke taking you all the way?" "Yes." Ruth looked across the room at Silas. Something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, more like the satisfaction of someone who'd been holding a position and just seen evidence that they were right about it. "Good," she said simply, and went back to the stove. They stayed 40 minutes, long enough to warm through, not long enough to stiffen. Silas thanked the Brenners with the straightforward brevity of a man who'd done it before, and Ruth Brenner pressed a wrapped bundle of food on Mara as they left that she tried to refuse and couldn't. "Winter's long," Ruth said. "Eat it." Mara tucked it in her satchel. They rode the second half in weather that had made up its mind. The snow was horizontal in gusts and vertical in the lulls and constant regardless, and the road was no longer visible in the conventional sense. Silas was navigating by landmarks she couldn't always identify, fence lines and rock formations and the angles of the land itself. She trusted him to know it because there was no alternative to trusting him, and also because she'd watched him for 3 weeks and understood that he was not a man who claimed competence he didn't have. Her hands eventually went back to his waist, without either of them making it a thing. The cold was serious now, not life-threatening, not yet, not with Cutter moving and body heat and the knowledge that Casper was ahead, but the kind of sustained cold that required active management, that required you to check your fingers and toes at intervals and move them deliberately to keep the circulation honest. She did this at regular intervals. She noticed Silas rolling his shoulders and flexing his hands on the reins for the same reason. An hour outside Casper, the snow let up enough to see. The town emerged from the white ahead of them in stages: first, the outline of the church steeple, then the main street's building fronts, then the particular glow of lit windows in the late afternoon gray. Mara had been gone from this town 3.5 weeks. It looked exactly the same and felt completely different. Not the town, but her, the way she was arriving in it. She'd left with nothing and a plan she believed in. She was returning with $40 and evidence that the plan had worked. She directed Silas to Dr. Heller's building, a narrow 2-story on the east side of town, and he tied Cutter at the post and followed her up the steps without being asked whether he was coming. Dr. Heller answered the door himself. He was a thin man in his 60s with wire spectacles and the careful manner of someone who delivered bad news often enough to have developed a professional gentleness around it. He looked at Mara and then at Silas and then back at Mara. "Miss Ellison," he said, "Dr. Heller, I have the payment." She had the bills in her hand before she was through the door. She'd counted them 3 times during the ride. He looked at the money. He looked at her. "Come in," he said, "both of you." Agnes Ellison was in the small heated room on the building's ground floor, which was Dr. Heller's recovery room, a space that was functional rather than comfortable, but that was genuinely warm, with a wood stove in the corner that was stoked properly and blankets that were adequate. Agnes was awake. She was propped up against the headboard of the narrow bed, and she was thinner than she'd been in October. And her color was not what Mara would have chosen for her. But her eyes were the same, sharp and dark and present, and full of something that was both relief and exasperation in a proportion only Agnes could produce. "You're late," Agnes said. Mara sat on the edge of the bed. Her throat had done something she was managing. "I'm on time." "You said winter. It's snowing." "I know it's snowing. I just rode through it." Agnes's eyes moved to Silas, who had stopped in the doorway. She looked at him for a moment with the particular focused attention of a woman who had been forming opinions about people for 67 years and had not slowed down. "Who is this?" she said. "Silas Rourke," Mara said. "He owns the ranch where I was working. He rode you here in a blizzard." "Yes." Agnes looked at Silas again. "Are you the one who offered to marry her if she fixed your ranch?" The silence in the room was significant. Silas looked at Mara. Mara looked at the blanket. "Yes," Silas said. Agnes said. It was a sound that contained a complete evaluation, a verdict, and several follow-up questions all simultaneously. Then she said, "Come in properly. You're letting the cold air in standing there." Silas came into the room. He sat in the chair by the wall, and Agnes looked at him for another moment. And then something in the old woman's face, the tension in it, said of it that Mara recognized as the face Agnes made when she'd been frightened and was not going to say so eased back towards something more like herself. While Dr. Heller settled the payment in the next room, Mara held her grandmother's hand and listened to her breathe and conducted the assessment she'd been running in her head since October. Agnes's color, her breathing rate, the temperature of her hand, the alertness in her eyes. The breathing was still wet in the lower register. Not worse than October, possibly marginally better, but not resolved. Dr. Heller came back and answered her questions with the directness she'd always respected in him. Agnes needed continued warmth through the winter. She needed the medication which he'd been supplying, and which he could continue to supply at a rate that was within reason. She needed not to be moved to a cold environment. "What constitutes a cold environment?" Mara said. He named a temperature range. She listened carefully. If a room could be maintained above that threshold reliably, she said, would that be adequate? In a properly heated room with consistent warmth and her medication, your grandmother has a reasonable chance of being significantly improved by spring, he said. The lung condition isn't reversible, but it's manageable under the right conditions. What are the right conditions? He listed them. She memorized them. Then she went back into Agnes's room and sat on the edge of the bed again and looked at her grandmother and said, I'm going to take you somewhere warm. I'm somewhere warm, Agnes said. Somewhere warmer than a doctor's recovery room. She paused. You'll have your own room, with a stove. Agnes looked at her. And there'll be medication, Mara said, and enough food. And somewhat she paused again. I'll be nearby. Agnes's eyes moved to Silas, who had been sitting in the chair by the wall through this entire exchange with the focused quietness of a man who understood he was witnessing something private and was choosing not to intrude on it while also not pretending to be somewhere else. His ranch, Agnes said. Yes, Mara said. Agnes looked at Silas with the same focused attention as before. She's worked for you for how long? 3.5 weeks, Silas said. And you're offering my granddaughter's sick grandmother a room. Yes. Why? The room was quiet. Silas was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was choosing words carefully rather than avoiding the question. Because I had a brother who needed a warm room in a bad winter, and I didn't find him one, he said. And because your granddaughter fixed something on my property that I'd been losing ground on for 7 years, and she did it because she needed to take care of you, and that he stopped. That matters. People who show up for the people they love, that matters. Agnes looked at him for a very long time. Then she looked at Mara. He's not as bad as he sounds, Agnes said, which from Agnes was a substantial endorsement. I know, Mara said. Getting Agnes ready to travel was not a fast process. Dr. Heller had concerns, which were legitimate, and which he expressed with appropriate gravity. Moving a patient with a serious lung condition in the middle of a blizzard ran counter to his medical instincts, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. Mara listened to every concern. She did not dismiss any of them. She asked about each risk factor specifically and listened to his assessment of the mitigation available. Then she said, if she stays here through winter, what's the ongoing cost? He named a figure. She didn't have it. The $40 covered what was owed, and the ongoing cost was a number she didn't have a plan for beyond the increasingly uncertain next step approach that had gotten her this far. He saw the calculation in her face. He was a perceptive man. The room she's in needs to be available by December, he said. I have 2 patients coming who'll need it. I know, Mara said. I'm not throwing her out. I know, Mara said again. I understand your position. I'm not asking you to resolve something that isn't your responsibility to resolve. He looked at her. He looked at Silas. He looked at Agnes, who was sitting in the bed with her coat on. She'd put it on herself, which Mara had noticed, which meant Agnes had already made her decision before anyone asked her. Wrap her well, Dr. Heller said. Keep her out of the direct wind. If she starts breathing in a way that sounds different from her baseline, stop and find shelter. He looked at Silas. You know where the Garrity homestead is? 4 miles east of the main road, about halfway to Holland. I know it, Silas said. If it gets bad, that's your stop. Margaret Garrity will know what to do. Silas nodded. They wrapped Agnes in every available blanket, and Silas had brought a second horse. Mara registered this only now. A smaller dun mare tied at the post beside Cutter that she hadn't fully processed when they'd arrived. He'd brought a second horse from Blackthorn. He'd planned for this. She stood at the post for a moment after she realized it, looking at the dun mare in the falling snow, and let the full understanding of what he'd done reach her, that he'd loaded Cutter and brought the mare, that he'd planned for 2 riders on the way back, before she'd asked him to come, before she'd even fully admitted to herself that she was hoping he would. He came out of the building behind her with Agnes's small bag. She didn't say anything about the horse. He didn't explain it. They lifted Agnes carefully onto Cutter, where she sat with the wrapped blankets, and the particular dignity of a woman who had strong opinions about being handled but was choosing, for once, to let people help her. Silas rode behind her to keep her steady, and Mara rode the dun mare alongside. And they moved out of Casper in the early evening snow, at a pace that was careful and deliberate, and that required every ounce of Silas's knowledge of this road and this weather. The first hour was the hardest. Agnes said nothing, which from Agnes was its own form of communication. She held herself upright with an effort that Mara could see and couldn't address without making it worse, because Agnes was the kind of person who found unsolicited acknowledgement of her difficulty more taxing than the difficulty itself. Mara rode alongside and watched her grandmother's back for the signs she'd learned to look for, the particular set of the shoulders, the rhythm of breathing, the way Agnes held her hands. Agnes held her hands steady. The snow had let up slightly by the time they reached the halfway point, reduced from the horizontal assault of the afternoon to something more vertical and manageable. The road was covered but recognizable. Silas read it the way he'd read it going in, and Cutter moved through the drifts with patient competence. At the Holland Creek crossing, Silas stopped and looked at the water. It was higher than it had been on the way in. The ford stones were fully submerged, and the current had taken on a sound that was a register lower than it had been, the sound of serious volume moving fast. "We can make it," he said. But he said it to Mara, not as a declaration, as an assessment that was asking for her confirmation. She looked at the crossing. She looked at Agnes. Agnes looked at the crossing and said, with the flat practicality of a woman who had crossed hard things before, "Get us across, Rourke." Silas looked at her for a moment. Something flickered in his expression, something that might have been the first stages of genuine affection, and then he turned Cutter toward the crossing. They went through in order: Silas and Agnes first, Mara and the dun mare second. The water was thigh-high on Cutter at the deepest, and Agnes made no sound as it rose around the horse's legs, and the blankets stayed clear of the waterline because Silas had lifted them without Agnes having to ask. The dun mare followed without argument, and they came out on the Blackthorn side of the creek with everyone wet to varying degrees and moving forward. The last hour was quiet. The snow had thinned to something nearly gentle by the time the ranch came into sight, and the light in the kitchen window was visible first. The lamp that Mara had left burning that morning, that had been burning all day in the empty house, throwing its yellow rectangle into the yard. Agnes said, from her position on Cutter, quietly enough that it was almost just to herself, "That's a good light." Mara heard it. She didn't answer, but something in her chest moved. They brought Cutter and the dun into the barn out of the wind, out of the snow, and helped Agnes down with the combined care of two people who were being very deliberate about not letting her feel handled. She stood in the barn on her own feet and looked around, at the compression brace, at the plumb wall, at the quality of the structure around her, and Mara watched her grandmother's face as she took it in. "You built this," Agnes said. "Silas helped," Mara said. Agnes looked at Silas. "She designed it?" "Every detail," he said. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at her granddaughter with an expression that was not surprise. Agnes had known for 50 years what Mara was capable of, but something else, something that was recognition mixed with something approaching wonder. At the gap between what you know about a person and the reality of seeing it standing in front of you. She put her hand on Mara's arm briefly. Mara covered it with her own. Then they helped Agnes across the yard and into the ranch house, where Mara had not yet seen the room that Silas had prepared. It was the room at the south end of the house, the one she'd never been in. She'd assumed it was storage, had never had occasion to investigate. He'd opened the door ahead of them and stepped back to let them through, and Mara went in first and stopped just inside the doorway. It was not a large room, but it was warm. The small cast-iron stove in the corner had been built up before they'd left that morning, and the room had held the heat in the way of a room that had been properly sealed against drafts, which she could see had been done recently. New caulking in the window frame and fresh cloth along the bottom of the door. There was a bed with blankets, real blankets, wool ones, more than adequate, and a small table and a chair, and on the table there was a lamp already lit, and beside it a small collection of things that stopped her entirely: a cup, a pitcher of water, a folded cloth, and a small paper-wrapped parcel that she recognized by its shape as the pain relief preparation doctor. Heller had been giving Agnes. She turned around. Silas was in the doorway. "You wrote to him," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "You wrote to Dr. Heller before we left. I rode out to the Brenner place 2 days ago and sent a letter with their son when he made his mail run," he said. "Heller sent a supply back with the return mail yesterday." She stared at him. He'd done this 2 days ago. While she was monitoring the well cure, while she was wrapping her wrists and calculating temperatures and not letting herself think too far forward, he'd been writing letters and arranging medication and preparing a room with caulked windows and a built-up stove. She didn't say anything. There was nothing she could say that would be the right size for what she was feeling. Agnes came up beside her and looked into the room. She stood there for a moment. Then she walked in, sat down on the edge of the bed, pressed her hand to the top of the blanket, and looked at Silas Rourke with the full weight of 67 years of judgment. "You'll do," she said. Silas looked at her for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Agnes picked up the cup from the table, poured water from the pitcher, and drank it with the deliberate satisfaction of a woman exercising authority over her own situation. She set the cup down and looked at Mara. "Stop standing in the doorway," she said. "You look like you're waiting for permission." Mara came into the room. Silas stayed in the doorway a moment longer, and then said quietly, "There's food on when you're ready," and walked back toward the kitchen. And Mara listened to his footsteps in the hall and thought about 2 days ago, about what he'd done 2 days ago, what it had meant for him to do it. What it said about who he'd been all along under the years, and the hardship, and the fighting of things he couldn't fix, because he'd been fighting them from the wrong direction. "Mara," Agnes said. She looked at her grandmother. Agnes looked back at her with the dark, sharp eyes that had never, in 25 years, failed to see exactly what was true. "Go eat something," Agnes said. "You look like you've been working for 3 weeks without stopping." "I have been working for 3 weeks without stopping." "I know," Agnes said. "I could tell from your letter." She lay back against the pillow and pulled the blanket up with the movement of someone who had been waiting for warmth for a long time and was finally, cautiously, allowing herself to inhabit it. "I could also tell other things from your letter." "Agnes, go eat," Mara went. In the kitchen, Silas had put food on the table, actual hot food, which she didn't ask about and which she understood he'd managed somehow in the time before they'd left, leaving it where it could be warmed. She sat down. He sat down across from her. Outside, the snow was still falling. Quieter now, the kind of snowfall that was settling into itself for a long stay. They ate in the easy silence she'd grown accustomed to over 3 weeks of working beside this man, and the ranch house held the warmth, and the barn outside was solid and plumb, and the well was clean, and in the south room at the end of the hall, Agnes Ellison was sleeping in a warm bed for the first time in months. Mara looked at the table, at the empty bowl, at her own hands scarred across the palms, healed enough to be functional. She looked up. Silas was watching her. He didn't look away when she caught him. She said, "Thank you," he said. "You don't owe me anything for it." "I know I don't," she said. "That's not why I'm saying it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're welcome." And it was simple and without ceremony, and that was exactly right. Outside, the blizzard pressed itself against the windows of Blackthorn Ranch, and the house stood against it the same way the barn stood against it, with the particular steadiness of something that had been properly repaired from the ground up. Not perfect, not without history, but holding. The blizzard stayed for 4 days. Not the kind of 4 days that passed with relative inconvenience and then released its hold, the kind that committed, that buried fence posts to their midpoints and turned the road to Casper into something theoretical rather than actual, that made the distance between the ranch house and the barn feel meaningful in a way it hadn't before the snow. Silas made that crossing 6 times a day, checking Cutter and the dun mare and the 2 remaining cattle he hadn't sold in the last hard year. And Mara went with him 4 of those 6, because the barn was where she could still be useful, and usefulness was the thing she understood how to inhabit when everything else felt uncertain. Agnes slept for most of the first 2 days, not the unhealthy sleep of someone declining, the sleep of a person who had been running on insufficient warmth and insufficient rest for months and had finally, in a room with a properly stoked stove and adequate blankets, been given permission by her own body to stop. Mara checked on her every 2 hours without making it obvious that she was checking every 2 hours. She'd stand in the doorway and listen to Agnes breathe still the wet sound in the lower register, but steadier than it had been in Casper, more regular, and then she'd go back to whatever she was doing. What she was doing mostly was thinking. The thinking was the part she hadn't had room for during the work. Now the work was done, and the storm had removed all other options, and the thinking arrived whether she wanted it or not. Filling the hours with the questions she'd been deferring since she'd walked through the gate of Blackthorn Ranch with a satchel and a dead man's notebook and $40 as her entire horizon. She'd reached the horizon. She didn't know what was on the other side of it. On the 3rd morning of the blizzard, she sat at the kitchen table with her grandfather's notebook, the last page, the one with the compression brace sketches and the 3 words she'd written after, and she looked at those words for a long time. He saw it. She'd written that about Silas, about the moment in the barn when he'd seen the compression approach she'd missed. She'd written it because it had mattered, and she'd known it mattered, and she hadn't known what else to do with the mattering, except to record it the way her grandfather had recorded things that he didn't yet fully understand, but knew were important. Silas came in from the morning barn check, knocked the snow from his boots at the door, and found her at the table. He looked at the notebook. He looked at her, poured 2 cups of coffee, and set one in front of her without being asked, which was something he'd started doing on the 2nd day. Not offering, not asking, just doing, the same way he'd started managing certain things without ceremony. The way you did when you'd been living alongside someone long enough to know their habits without having made a formal study of them. He sat down. "How's the dun mare?" Mara said. "Fine." Better than fine. She likes having Cutter for company. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Your grandmother was awake when I came through the hall." Mara looked up. "She didn't call for me. She was reading. She had a book. I don't know where she found it. She travels with 2 books. She says one is in case the first one disappoints her." He almost smiled. "She said good morning when I passed the door. Then she said the stove was running a little lean, and she'd appreciate it if I'd add another log." "What did you say?" "I added another log." Mara looked at him across the table. "She's testing you. I know she is. How do you know?" "Because she watched me add the log the way a person watches something they're evaluating," he said. And then she said thank you in a way that had a score attached to it. Mara looked down at her coffee. "What score do you think you got?" "Passing," he said, "maybe a little above passing." "That's actually very good. I got that sense," he said dryly. She almost laughed. It arrived in her throat, and she let part of it out, which surprised her, because it had been a long time since anything had gotten past her guard that fast and that easily. Silas heard it, and his expression did the thing it did when something surprised him and pleased him simultaneously, the thing he almost never let finish before he controlled it back. They drank their coffee. Outside, the wind made its case against the windows and failed to gain entry. After a while, Silas said, "The storm's going to break tomorrow." "Maybe the day after." "I know. I've been watching the pressure." And then she looked at him. The question was simple on the surface and not simple underneath, and they both knew it. "And then spring is 4 months away," she said carefully. "Agnes needs warmth and medication through all 4 of them. She can have the south room through all 4 of them," he said. "I told you that. You told me that in the context of a crisis situation that required an immediate solution," Mara said. "That's different from," she stopped, organized what she meant. I'm not in the habit of assuming that what someone offers in an emergency is what they want to be held to in ordinary time. He looked at her steadily. I'm not a man who offers things in a crisis that I plan to retract when the crisis is over. I know that, she said. I'm trying to say something else. Say it then. She set her coffee cup down. She looked at the table and then at him, and she held his gaze the way she'd held it that first afternoon on the porch, because looking away was still the thing that gave ground she didn't mean to give. I don't know what I'm doing here, she said. After winter, I don't have a plan. I finished the plan I had, and now there's a space where the plan used to be, and I'm not, she paused. I'm not comfortable in that space. He was quiet for a moment. What would you want to do if you were building a plan from the beginning? She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. I'd want to finish the drainage work on the east pasture. The runoff pattern during the autumn deluge created erosion channels that are going to worsen in spring snowmelt. I'd want to redesign the water storage so the property has reserve capacity during dry periods. She stopped herself. Keep going, he said. I'd want to look at the Holland Creek Valley properties that were damaged in the fall flooding and see if what I know could help them. Cole's South Pasture has the same shale substrate issue the barn had. The Brenner place has a drainage problem I saw in 20 minutes from horseback. She looked at him. That's not a plan for what I'm doing here. That's a list of problems I can see. Maybe it's the same thing, he said. She looked at him. He set his cup down. When I offered you the foreman job, you didn't offer me the foreman job. You offered to marry me. When I made the offer I genuinely regret the form of, he said, which was as close to a direct apology as she suspected he was capable of and was, honestly, more than she'd expected. I had a foreman position that needed filling. Still does. The difference is that now I know what you're actually worth, which is considerably more than what I'd pay a foreman. She was very still. I'm not offering charity, he said, and his voice had gone to the flat, careful register he used when something mattered, and he was trying not to let that make him clumsy. I'm offering a partnership. The ranch needs someone who understands what's wrong with the land and how to fix it, and I've spent 3 weeks watching you do exactly that. I can run cattle. I understand seasonal management and market timing and how to work with hired men. What I don't understand, what I've been getting wrong for years, is the ground underneath everything. That's yours. That's genuinely yours. Mara looked at the table. At her hands, at the notebook. A partnership, she said. Equal terms. You'd need to agree to them, obviously. He stopped and started again, which she'd almost never seen him do. I'm trying to ask you to stay. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm making a mess of the mechanics of it. She looked up. He was looking back at her with the fully open expression, the one she'd seen twice before, briefly, both times quickly controlled. This time he didn't control it. He sat with it, which cost him something she could see it costing. She said, I need to think about it. I know. I'm not saying no. I know that too, he said, and something in his face settled, not relief exactly, but the easing of a sustained tension, the kind that came from having said a true thing and had it received without damage. Agnes's voice came from the hall. The stove is running lean again. They looked at each other. Mara got up and went to add the log. The storm broke on the 4th day, as Silas had predicted, with the abruptness that Wyoming weather specialized in here, and then not. The sky clearing from the west, in a fast, hard sweep that left everything white and still and shockingly bright under the winter sun. The snow on the ground was deep enough to reshape the landscape, filling the hollows and softening the fence lines, turning Blackthorn Ranch into something that looked, from a distance, like a clean version of itself. Agnes came out of the south room. On the morning the storm broke and stood in the kitchen doorway in her coat and looked out the window at the white yard with the expression of someone conducting an inspection. I want to see the barn, she said. Agnes, I've been inside for 4 days. I want to see the barn your grandfather's notebook built. Mara looked at her. Agnes's color was better not completely restored, but better. and her breathing was cleaner than it had been in Casper, the wet sound present but quieter. She was standing without holding the doorframe. Boots and both coats, Mara said. I'm not a child, no, but you're going to wear both coats. Agnes wore both coats. Silas cleared a path to the barn while they prepared, moving snow with the flat shovel in the particular efficient way of someone who'd done it many times and had stopped having feelings about it. He didn't make a production of it. He just did it, and by the time Agnes and Mara came out the front door, there was a walkable corridor from the porch to the barn entrance. Agnes walked it slowly but without assistance. Inside the barn, she stood in the center of the space and looked at the left wall, the compression brace, the pillar caps, the plumb line that was now simply the wall's natural position, no lean, no drift. She walked to the brace and put her hand on the main timber, the way Mara's grandfather used to examine his own work, pressing the flat of her palm against the wood and feeling for what wasn't visible. She stood there for a while. He would have been proud of you, Agnes said. Mara was standing beside her. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the brace, at the wedge Silas had driven home in the rainstorm, at the connection points that had held through a blizzard, and let the words reach the place they were aimed at. I know, she said, and she meant it without performance. She did know. The knowing didn't make it not hurt, but it was a clean hurt, the kind that meant something rather than the kind that just cost. Agnes removed her hand from the timber. She turned around and looked at Silas, who was standing near the barn entrance with the shovel, giving them space in the way she'd noticed he gave space, not withdrawing, just not encroaching. My granddaughter tells me you've offered her a partnership, Agnes said. Silas looked at Mara. Mara looked at the brace. Yes, he said. Kind of partnership. The ranch. Equal terms. Agnes was quiet for a moment. That's a business arrangement. It's a start, he said. Agnes looked at him with the dark, sharp eyes. Are you in love with her? The barn was very quiet. Silas looked at Mara for a long moment, long enough that Mara had to make a decision about whether to look back, and made the decision to look back and did. I don't know what I am yet, he said, honestly. I know that I've watched her work for 3.5 weeks, and I haven't once looked away. I know that when she was in that excavation, and I was standing at the rim, the worst thought I had all day was what happened if something went wrong down there. I know that this ranch, he paused, this ranch feels different than it did a month ago. Not just because of what she fixed, because of how she fixed it. Because I understand it differently now, and I understand it differently because of her. Agnes absorbed this. That's more honest than most men manage, she said finally. I'm trying to be. Agnes looked at Mara. Well, Mara looked at her grandmother. I told him I needed to think about it. You've been thinking about it for 4 days. I've been managing a blizzard for 4 days. Mara Louise Ellison, you've been thinking about it. The use of all 3 names was Agnes's highest caliber instrument, and both of them knew it. Silas made a sound that was almost a laugh. Mara looked at him sharply. He composed himself with visible effort. I'll be in the house, Agnes said, and walked out of the barn with the deliberate steadiness of a woman who had made her point and saw no reason to linger. The barn was quiet. Mara looked at the brace, at the wedge. At the wall. She likes you, she said. I know. She doesn't like most people. I know that too. She turned and looked at him, at this man who had laughed at her on a porch and climbed into a trench in a rainstorm and driven a wedge into granite and cord timber and written letters to a doctor and caulked a window and added logs to a stove when an old woman asked him to and sat across a kitchen table and said, I'm trying to ask you to stay with his face completely open. The east pasture drainage, she said. I'd want to start on it in early spring, before the snowmelt creates the erosion channels. He was very still. And the water storage design. I want to sink a collection cistern above the property line on the north slope. It'll give us reserve capacity through July. All right, he said quietly. And the neighboring properties, Cole's South pasture and the Brenner drainage situation. I want to help them, not as charity, as actual engineering consultation. I think there's a way to build something here that's bigger than one ranch. I think so too, she looked at him. I'm not easy to work with. I've been told that. I've noticed that, he said. I'm not particularly easy either. We've disagreed about things. Several times we'll disagree again. Probably tomorrow, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The barn around them was solid and still and smelling of hay and cold timber and the particular smell of a structure that was doing what it was supposed to do. Yes, she said. He blinked. Yes, which part? The partnership, she said. And the rest of it. The part you haven't officially asked yet, but that we've both been talking around for 4 days. She held his gaze. When you ask it properly, I'll say yes to that too. But I want you to ask it properly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the directness that was the truest thing about him, no ceremony, no performance, just a man saying a true thing to a woman who'd earned his complete honesty, he said, "Will you stay at Blackthorn? As a partner, and if you're willing as more than that. As someone I intend to make a life with if you'll have me." She said yes. He crossed the distance between them, and she stayed where she was. And when he put his hand against her face, the hand that had steadied a pillar in a rainstorm and driven a wedge into timber and brought clay from a creek bank in the dark, she leaned into it. Not because she needed the steadiness, but because she wanted it, which was different. And the difference mattered more than she could have explained. He kissed her with the same quality his best work had present, and deliberate, and without pretending to be something it wasn't. Outside, a winter crow called from the barn roof and then went somewhere else. Spring came to the Wyoming Valley in the way it always did, not all at once, not as a gift, but incrementally, the way things earned are usually delivered. First the freeze losing its overnight grip, then mud with new grass under it, then one morning the particular quality of light that said winter was over, not as a promise, but as a fact. Mara was in the east pasture on the morning that light arrived. She'd been working the drainage redesign since the 3rd week of March, when the ground had thawed enough to take a spade. She'd mapped the erosion channels that the autumn deluge had cut, traced them back to their sources, designed a redirection system that would carry the spring snowmelt away from the pasture floor and into a collection point she'd identified on the lower slope, a natural bowl in the terrain that, with minimal shaping, could hold several thousand gallons before it overflowed into the creek drainage. She was not working alone. Ephraim Cole's hired man was with her, a young fellow named Davis, whom Cole had sent over with a formality that was Cole's version of an apology, though no apology had been spoken. Cole himself had come by 2 weeks prior on the pretext of looking at his own fence line that bordered the Blackthorn property, and had ended up standing in the pasture for 40 minutes while Mara explained the drainage redesign, asking questions that started skeptical and became incrementally something closer to genuinely interested. He'd sent Davis the following Monday. "Tell him it's an exchange," Cole had said to Silas, which was Cole's version of asking for help framed as reciprocity rather than need, which Mara understood perfectly and accepted on those terms, because the goal was the pasture, not the credit. Davis was 22 and strong and learned quickly when information was delivered without condescension, which was Mara's natural mode, because condescension had always seemed to her a waste of time that could be used to actually explain things. By noon, they'd completed the main channel redirect, and Mara stood at the collection point and looked at the water moving where she'd designed it to move. Not perfectly, not without the adjustments she'd already noted for the following week, but essentially correctly, the way a plan that had been built on sound principles usually manifested in the real world. Sound but imperfect. She'd made her peace with imperfect. Silas brought lunch out to the pasture at midday, which she'd started doing when the outdoor work began. Not because she needed feeding, she was capable of remembering to eat, but because he'd observed that when she was deep in a problem, she sometimes didn't, and because he had his own ways of showing things that he was still developing the vocabulary for. He handed her a wrapped cloth and sat on the slope beside her and looked at the drainage channel. "It's working," he said, "so far. You sound like that's a problem." The real test is the melt surge in the next 2 weeks, she said. Collection Point handles the volume. We'll know the design is right. Until then, it's a hypothesis with encouraging early data. He looked at her sideways. You are the only person I have ever met who describes a working drainage channel as a hypothesis. It's accurate. It's also, he stopped. Also what? Nothing. Eat your lunch. She ate. He sat beside her on the slope. Below them, the collection point filled slowly with clear snowmelt water, finding its level with the patient logic of water that had finally been given somewhere useful to go. Cole asked me yesterday if you'd be willing to look at his south pasture, Silas said. I know, Davis mentioned it, and I'll look at it next week. It's the same substrate issue, different configuration. It'll need its own solution, not just a copy of what we did here. Silas nodded. He'd learned not to ask if she was sure about things. He'd replaced that question with the more useful one of what do you need, which was a different question entirely, and one that generally produced actionable answers. Ruth Brenner stopped by while you were out here, he said. She's asked if you'd come for supper Friday. She said to tell you that Ephraim Cole will be there, which I think is her way of arranging a meeting without calling it one. She wants me to talk to Cole directly. I think she wants Cole to have to sit at her table and say what he actually thinks, instead of sending proxies. Mara thought about it. I'll go, I figured. She looked at him. You could come. I was planning to. She looked back at the collection point. A red-winged blackbird had landed on the slope above it and was doing the thing red-winged blackbirds did in spring, announcing itself at a volume disproportionate to its size, staking its claim on the available territory with a confidence that didn't seem concerned with what the territory thought about it. She'd always liked that about them. Agnes walked to the barn this morning, Mara said. Silas looked at her. On her own, I watched from the window. She didn't know I was watching. She paused. She stood outside the barn door for a few minutes and looked at the wall. Then she went back inside and made herself tea. He was quiet. She didn't say anything about it, Mara said. But when I came in, she looked at me in that way. She has the way where she's already finished the conversation in her head and is just waiting for you to catch up. What's the conversation? Mara looked at the water. I think it's the conversation where she tells me that my grandfather would have liked it here. Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured in the way it was when something was sitting close to the surface. I think he would have, he said, based on his notebook. Based on what he taught you. He paused. I think he was someone who understood that the work was never really about the thing you were fixing. She looked at him. The barn, he said, the well. Pasture. He knew it wasn't about those things. What was it about? Teaching someone else how to see, Silas said. That's what's in those margins. All those notes. He wasn't writing it down to remember it himself. He was writing it down for whoever came after. She looked at the notebook in her satchel. She'd moved the satchel less than 6 feet from herself for 3.5 months. She wasn't sure she'd thought consciously about why, but sitting on the slope of the east pasture with the drainage channel working below her and the spring light coming in clean from the west, she thought she understood it. She'd been carrying him with her, not as weight, as company. I want to write in it, she said. I've been leaving the last pages blank. I don't know why I kept stopping. I know why, Silas said. She looked at him. Because writing in the last pages meant it was finished, he said. And if it was finished, then his part of it was over. She was very still. His part is over, Silas said gently. Not cruelly. The way you say a true thing to someone who already knows it and just needs to hear it from outside themselves to make it real. What you put in the last pages is yours. That's not an ending. That's what comes next. She looked at the notebook. She opened it. The last pages, the ones she'd been guarding since October, were blank except for the compression brace sketches and the 3 words she'd written in November. He saw it. She picked up the charcoal she kept in the outside pocket of the satchel. She wrote, "The ground doesn't lie. Follow the problem down until you find what's holding." She looked at what she'd written. Then she wrote, "He taught me that. I'm teaching it forward. She closed the notebook. Silas was looking at the collection point. He didn't comment on what she'd done, because he understood, the way he'd come to understand a lot of things about her, that some moments were complete in themselves and didn't need commentary. She put the notebook back in the satchel. Davis called from the far end of the channel, a question about the secondary redirect angle, and Mara stood up and called back the answer and started walking toward him, and the morning continued the way working mornings do, with the next problem presenting itself as soon as the previous one resolved, which was not a burden but a kind of ongoing argument with the world that she'd always preferred to the alternative. The supper at Ruth Brenner's on Friday was everything Mara had expected and a few things she hadn't. Ephraim Cole was there, as promised, with his wife and his 17-year-old son Thomas, who spent the first part of the meal looking at Mara with the unconcealed curiosity of a young person in the presence of someone who had done something he couldn't categorize. She recognized the look. She'd worn it herself at that age, sitting next to her grandfather while he explained things that didn't fit neatly into any box she'd been given. Cole himself was himself. He didn't begin with graciousness. He began with the careful assessment of a man who had revised his position on something and was not entirely comfortable with the revision, which Mara respected more than false warmth would have been. "Your drainage work in the east pasture," he said, about 20 minutes into the meal, with the abruptness of someone who has decided to address the thing directly rather than approach it sideways. "Davis says you redirected the main runoff channel to a collection point on the lower slope." "That's right. How much capacity?" she told him. He was quiet, doing arithmetic. "That's more than the east pasture needs. The collection point is shared slope. The overflow feeds into the Holland Creek tributary naturally. What it doesn't drain gets stored through July." He looked at her. "You designed for the whole slope, not just your property." "The slope doesn't respect property lines," she said. "The water that damages coal land in a wet spring comes from the same system that affects blackthorn. Fixing one without the other is," she paused, found the right word, "partial." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his son Thomas, who was watching Mara with the expression of someone who has just seen something added to his list of possible futures. "My south pasture," Cole said. "Yes, you've looked at it?" "Not yet. I plan to next week. Same substrate issue as Rourke's barn?" "Similar. Different configuration. It'll need its own approach." He was quiet again. He drank his coffee. He looked at the table in the way of a man who is recalculating something he thought was already settled. Ruth Brenner set a pie on the table and looked at Mara with the expression of someone who has arranged something and is satisfied with how it's landing. "Ephraim," Ruth said, with the cheerful directness of a woman who had been watching men circle things for 40 years, "just ask her." Cole looked at his wife. His wife looked at the pie. Cole looked back at Mara. "I'd like you to look at the south pasture," he said, "and tell me what needs doing," and a pause, what it would cost. Mara looked at Silas, who was sitting beside her and who had been drinking his coffee and watching the conversation with the focused neutrality of a man who understood his role here was witness rather than participant. He gave her nothing with his face, which was exactly right. She looked back at Cole. "I'll look at it Tuesday," she said. "After I see it, I can tell you what's required and what it's worth. I don't quote before I diagnose. That's a principle I don't bend on." Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded short once, with the particular quality of a man who has spent his life around people who do know what they're talking about and has enough experience to recognize when he's in that company. "Tuesday," he said. Thomas Cole asked. Across the table, with the directness of youth that hadn't yet learned to be indirect, "Where did you study?" "My grandfather's notebook," Mara said, "and everything I could find after that." "You didn't go to school?" "Not for this." Thomas looked at her with the specific expression of a young person encountering an idea that rearranges something. "But you know more than the men who did." "I know different things," she said. School teaches principles. The field teaches what the principles actually do when the ground isn't level and the weather doesn't cooperate, and the solution you plan for doesn't fit the problem you find. She paused. Neither one is enough on its own. Thomas thought about this. Cole was watching his son, Ruth Brenner, cut the pie. Walking back to Blackthorn Ranch in the spring dark afterward, they'd taken the horses, but the evening was mild enough and the road clear enough that they walked the last half-mile leading them. Because neither of them was in a hurry, Silas said, "Cole's going to tell every rancher in the valley about Tuesday." "I know. You're ready for that?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "But I don't think readiness is the precondition. I think you just do the next thing and develop readiness for the thing after it." He was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather say that?" "I did," she said, just now." She paused. "He might have said something like it. It's getting harder to tell which thoughts are mine and which ones I inherited." "Maybe they're both," he said. She considered that. Maybe. The ranch came into view, the windows lit, and she thought, as she had the evening they'd brought Agnes home through the blizzard, about what a lit window meant. She'd grown up in a house that was sometimes warm and sometimes wasn't, sometimes lit and sometimes not, depending on the coal supply and the weather and the particular state of things at any given moment. A window that was reliably lit was not a small thing. It was not something she intended to take for granted. She didn't think Silas did either. They were married after the spring thaw, in the way that things get done in Wyoming, when the people involved are practical, and the situation is clear, and there's no particular reason to wait. It was not a large event. Agnes sat in the front chair. She'd insisted on a chair rather than standing, which was one of several firm opinions she'd expressed about the proceedings, and Ruth Brenner came, and Ephraim Cole and his family, and the Garrity family whose homestead had been the named shelter point during the blizzard, and Davis, who had continued working the Blackthorn drainage project through spring, and had developed an easy competence with Mara's methods that made him genuinely useful rather than just present. The justice of the peace was a man named Alderman, who had been marrying people in this valley for 30 years, and who had long ago stopped expecting weddings to look any particular way. Mara wore the dress Agnes had been altering. For 3 weeks her grandmother's hands were not what they'd been, but they were steady for fine work, and the alterations were good. The kind of good that comes from caring about the specific person the garment is for, rather than the general idea of what a dress should be. It was deep blue, which Agnes had insisted on. "It's a working color," Agnes had said when Mara questioned it. "You're a working person. Wear something honest." She wore something honest. Silas looked at her the way he'd looked at the compression brace the morning. It held like a thing that had exceeded what he'd thought was possible and was still processing the gap. She looked at him the way she looked at a problem she'd finally understood correctly. They said what they meant to say. They meant it. The summer that followed was the hardest working summer of Mara's life, and she had not had easy summers. Cole's South pasture took 3 weeks and a redesigned drainage system that was more complex than the Blackthorn solution because the shale configuration ran at an angle to the slope, which meant the water didn't behave the way a straight reading of the terrain suggested. She'd caught it on the second day of her survey and recalculated from there, which cost her a day but saved Cole 3 weeks of failed implementation. He paid her without complaint, which from Cole was its own form of warmth. 2 other properties in the valley came to her through the summer, one through Cole's recommendation, through Ruth Brenner's, and she handled them both with the same methodology she'd developed at Blackthorn, the same principle her grandfather had laid down in the margins of his notebook: follow the problem down until you find what's holding. Don't treat the symptom. Don't fight the ground. Understand it. The cistern above the Blackthorn North Slope went in August, a project that she and Silas built together over 2 weeks, which were the most consistently argued 2 weeks of their marriage, and also, she would think afterward, some of the best. They disagreed about the cistern liner approach on the 3rd day and didn't speak for most of the 4th, and on the 5th morning Silas came into the kitchen with a sketch he'd made and put it on the table in front of her without preamble. and she looked at it for 5 minutes and made 2 modifications with the charcoal and slid it back across, and he looked at it for 5 minutes and said fine, and that was that. The cistern held when the August dry spell came. The pastures stayed green 2 weeks longer than the neighboring properties. Agnes noticed. Agnes noticed everything. She'd regained, over the spring and summer, something close to her pre-illness self, not entirely. The lung condition was managed rather than resolved, and would always be managed rather than resolved. But she moved through the ranch house and occasionally the yard with the authority of someone who has staked a claim and is satisfied with it. She had opinions about the kitchen organization. She had opinions about the garden plot that Mara had put in on the south side of the house, mostly the wrong kind of vegetables and the wrong configuration, according to Agnes. She had opinions about the window placement for light during afternoon reading. She expressed these opinions to Silas with the directness of a woman who had decided at some point in the winter that he could handle directness and that handling it was his ongoing responsibility. He could, and it was. He'd learned through the winter and into spring that Agnes's directness was not criticism in the conventional sense. It was engagement. She'd been direct with people she'd dismissed. She was direct with people she'd decided were worth the effort. It was, Mara explained to him one evening, the highest form of respect Agnes was capable of expressing. She told me the barn brace was ugly, he said. She told you it was ugly. She said, that brace is not beautiful, but it is correct, which is the more important quality. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's a compliment. That's the highest compliment Agnes gives anything. He thought about it. Not beautiful, but correct. Yes. He looked at the barn from the window. I'll take it, he said. The first winter after the marriage was different from every winter Blackthorn Ranch had seen in years. The barn held through 2 significant storms without requiring any attention except the ordinary maintenance of a structure that was doing what it was supposed to do. The well remained clean. She'd checked the barrier integrity in late October, found it sound, made one small addition to the clay lining on the north face where she'd seen a hairline beginning that hadn't been there in summer. She'd caught it early. She'd caught it because she'd been looking for it, which was the principle, which was always the principle. The cistern gave them reserve water through the first cold snap when the creek dropped below useful level. The east pasture drainage handled the early snow melt without cutting new channels. In December, Thomas Cole appeared at the Blackthorn Gate on a Tuesday morning with a notebook and a request that was awkward in the way of a 17-year-old asking for something he wasn't entirely sure how to frame. He wanted to learn what she knew, not generally. Specifically the soil mechanics, the load principles, the water system logic. He'd been watching all spring and summer, he said. His father had let him help on the South Pasture project. He thought he understood the surface of it, but he wanted to understand the depth. Mara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a girl of 16 sitting next to an old man at a table covered in books, asking questions that he answered with his full attention, treating her like someone for whom the answers were important and correct and worth giving at the same depth he'd give them to anyone. She said Tuesday and Thursday mornings, I'll expect you before the barn work starts. Thomas said, yes, ma'am. She thought, that's what her grandfather had said, once, about passing things forward. Not the knowledge, exactly knowledge you could get from books. The habit of looking. The willingness to go 12 feet down when everyone around you thought 8 was sufficient. These understanding that the visible problem and the actual problem were almost never the same thing. You couldn't put that in a textbook. You could only show it to someone, over and over, until they started doing it themselves without thinking. She started with Thomas the following Tuesday. She began where her grandfather had begun with her, not with the answers, but with the questions. Not with here is what is wrong, but with here is how you look at something and find out what's wrong. She handed him a notebook, new, empty, pages waiting, and said the same thing her grandfather had said to her at 16. Write down everything you observe before you write down anything you conclude, she said. Observation is always more reliable than interpretation. You can revise a conclusion. You can't add what you failed to notice. Thomas wrote it down. She looked at the open notebook in his hands, at the new handwriting beginning to fill the first page, and felt something settle in her that had been in motion since October of the previous year, a process completing itself, a loop closing in the way that loops close when you've finally understood what they were about. The notebook that had carried her grandfather's knowledge to her and her own knowledge to Silas, and through Silas back to her, it was passing forward again. Not literally, but essentially, that was what it had always been for. Years accumulated the way good years do, not without difficulty, but with enough in them that the difficulty didn't define the whole. Blackthorn Ranch became something the valley recognized without quite having a word for, a property that had been failing and wasn't anymore. Managed by people who understood something about the ground, beneath the work, that other people were still learning to see. Mara was consulted on 4 other properties through the following 2 years, and 2 of those consultations turned into ongoing arrangements that were not employment and not charity, but the particular form of cooperation that develops between people who have figured out they need each other's knowledge. Cole's south pasture recovered. The Brenner drainage problem was resolved in a single week once Mara was able to look at it properly. Thomas Cole, at 19, identified a substrate issue on a neighboring property before it caused damage, which was the real measure. Not that he'd learned the answers, but that he'd learned how to look for the questions. Agnes lived at Blackthorn Ranch through 2 winters and into a 3rd spring, which was more than doctor. Heller had suggested when Mara had first pressed him for an honest estimate. She walked the barn twice a week when the weather allowed it and sat in the kitchen when it didn't and continued to have opinions about everything, which was the truest sign of her health. In the 2nd spring, she told Mara, on an ordinary morning in the kitchen with coffee between them, that she thought her husband would have liked the notebook ending. Mara looked at her grandmother. The last pages, Agnes said. What you wrote, teaching it forward, she wrapped both hands around her cup. He always said the best thing you could build wasn't a structure. It was a person who understood how to build structures. He said that to you? Many times. Agnes looked at the window. He also said that you were going to be better at it than he was. He said that before you were 10 years old. Mara was quiet. He was right, Agnes said, with the flat matter-of-fact certainty that was the signature of every true thing she'd ever said. It was not a morning that was dramatic. The coffee was ordinary. The light through the kitchen window was early spring light, uncertain and thin. Outside, Silas was moving between the barn and the fence line, doing the ordinary work of a ranch in ordinary operation, the work that didn't require crisis or rescue, but simply required someone to show up every day and do it correctly. The barn wall was plumb, the well was clean, the cistern on the north slope was full from the winter snowpack. Nothing was perfect. The east pasture secondary channel needed clearing before the main melt. The south fence had 3 posts that needed replacing before summer. The dun mare had developed a habit of testing the latch on her stall, which was inconvenient but not dangerous. These were the problems of a functioning operation. Mara had come to understand, over the past year and a half, the significant difference between the problems of a failing thing and the problems of a functioning thing. The problems of a functioning thing were workable. They were the kind that assumed your continued presence, that expected you to show up tomorrow and address them because tomorrow existed and you would be in it. She'd spent a lot of her life working without that assumption. She had it now. She went outside to help with the fence posts. Silas looked up when she came around the corner of the barn. He looked at her the way he still looked at her sometimes, with the quality of noticing she'd stopped bracing for and started simply receiving. South fence, she said. I know. I was going to ask if you had time. I have time. She picked up the post driver. They worked the south fence line through the morning, replacing the posts in the practical silence of 2 people who had long since stopped needing words for the things that didn't require them. When they needed to talk, they talked. When they didn't, they didn't. The valley around them was coming back to life the way it did every year.
The grass in the low places finding green before the higher ground.
The creek running full and fast with the melt. The particular light of early Wyoming spring that was harsh and clear and didn't spare anything it touched. Everything was visible in that light, including, Mara thought, driving the final post home with 3 sure strikes, the distance between what this place had been and what it was now. Not because she'd arrived with some extraordinary gift. Because she'd been willing to go 12 feet down when 8 was where everyone else had stopped. Because she'd known that the visible problem was almost never the actual problem. Because she'd had always understood, from the first page of her grandfather's notebook that the real work wasn't in the repair. It was in the understanding that made the repair hold. She set the post driver down. She looked at the fence line straight, solid, doing what a fence was supposed to do. Behind her, the barn stood the same way. And inside the house, in the south room with the caulked windows and the properly stoked stove, Agnes Ellison was sitting in the good chair by the window with her second book the backup, the one she kept for when the first one disappointed her open in her lap, reading in the morning light. She was warm. She was home. So was Mara. For the first time in a long time since before her grandfather died, since before the world had become a problem she was always racing to solve, she let herself stand still in it. Just for a moment the fence was solid. The ground beneath it was understood. The work had been done correctly from the foundation up. That was enough. That had always been, when she was honest with herself, exactly enough.